Have you ever heard a story so grand, so unbelievable, that it just had asterisk to be true? A tale that feels woven into the very fabric of a landscape. Today, we're journeying back in time, deep into the heart of North America's vast, untamed forests, to uncover the story of a man, or maybe a myth, larger than life itself. This is the legend of Paul Bunyan. Picture this. The 19th century. The air is thick with the scent of pine and sawdust. Across the Great Lakes region, from Minnesota to Michigan, a new kind of frontier is being forged, not with plows, bat wheat, axes. This is the era of the lumberjack, a time of grueling work, towering trees, and long, cold nights. And around the crackling campfires, as the shadows danced and the timber wolves howled in the distance, a story began to take shape, a story whispered from one camp to the next, growing taller with each telling. They spoke of a man, Paul Bunyan, born so big that it took 5 giant storks to deliver him. As a baby, his cradle was a massive log barge floating on the waters of Puget Sound, and when he rocked it, he caused tides that flooded coastal towns. As he grew, his footsteps were said to be so heavy they could shake the very ground, leaving behind small ponds with every stride. His laughter wasn't just a sound, it was a force of nature. A booming echo that could start avalanches and send birds scattering for miles. This wasn't just any lumberjack. He was the king of them all, a colossus who stood taller than the tallest pines. They said he could fell an entire forest with a single swing of his enormous, double-bitted axe. His lungs were so powerful that when he blew his nose, he could clear a path through a blizzard. When he needed a new comb for his magnificent beard, he'd simply uproot a whole pine tree and use that. These weren't just idle boasts. For the men who spent their days in the demanding, often dangerous world of logging, the tales of Paul Bunyan were more than simple entertainment. He was an embodiment of their own strength, their endurance, and their ambition. In a world where they were tasked with taming a wilderness that seemed infinite, Paul Bunyan was the hero who could do the impossible. He represented the American spirit of the time, big, bold, and capable of conquering any challenge. The stories spread like wildfire. Every lumberjack, it seemed, had a personal encounter to add to the legend. One might claim Paul created the Mississippi River by accident when his water wagon sprang a leak. Another would swear that the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota were nothing more than the footprints left behind by Paul and his giant blue ox, Babe, during a long winter's walk. Yes, Babe the blue ox. You can't talk about Paul Bunyan without mentioning his loyal and equally massive companion. We'll delve much deeper into the incredible tales of Babe in our next chapter. But for now, just imagine an ox, so enormous that the distance between its horns was 42 axe handles and a plug of tobacco. Together, Paul and Babe were an unstoppable force, shaping the very geography of the continent as they worked. But here's the question that lingers in the misty morning air of the North Woods. Was Paul Bunyan real? Did a man of such epic proportions actually walk this earth? Or was he simply a tall tale, a folk hero born from the collective imagination of hard-working men who needed a legend to look up to? The lines are blurry, lost to time in the countless retellings around flickering fires. Some historians trace the origins of Bunyan to a real-life French-Canadian logger, perhaps a man named Paul Bunyan, known for his impressive strength and skill during the Papineau Rebellion in Canada. The stories could have been inspired by his real-life feats, then exaggerated and embellished as they crossed the border and spread through the American logging camps. The name Bunyan itself might be a mangled version of a French-Canadian expression. Bunyan, a cry of surprise or astonishment. Imagine seeing a man fell a mighty tree with seemingly impossible speed and strength. Bunyan would be a fitting reaction. So, the legend sits in that magical space between fact and fiction. He's a folk hero, a symbol of industrial might, and a whimsical giant who carved mountains and dug rivers. He is the ultimate personification of the grit and spirit required to build a nation. Paul Bunyan is a story that feels as ancient and enduring as the great forests he once roamed. He is the rustle of leaves in the wind, the echo of an axe in the distance, the impossibly grand landscape of North America itself. The legend of Paul Bunyan is a vast and winding one, full of incredible characters, impossible feats, and hilarious misadventures. We've only just scratched the surface of this larger-than-life figure. What other incredible deeds did he perform? Who are the members of his legendary logging crew? And what about that famous blue ox? Join us next time for Chapter 2, as we introduce the one and only Babe the Blue Ox, and explore the inseparable bond between a giant and his best friend. You won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into American folklore. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the incredible legend of Paul Bunyan. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey into the heart of American folklore. Last time, we explored the origins and the enduring appeal of the tall tale. Today, we're diving headfirst into the story of the big man himself, Paul Bunyan, with Chapter 2, The Birth of a Giant. Get ready, because this is a story so big, it can barely be contained. Now, you and I were probably born in a hospital or at home, maybe weighing 7 or 8 pounds. But Paul Bunyan, his arrival was a national event. They say when Paul was born up in the woods of Maine, or maybe it was Minnesota, or even Canada, the storytellers can't quite agree. The whole state shook. The storks that usually delivered babies had to call for backup. It took 5 giant storks, wings straining, just to carry the little fella, and when they finally set him down, he weighed over 100 pounds. His first cries were so loud they scared fish right out of the Great Lakes and sent birds flying south for the winter, even though it was the middle of July. His parents, bless their hearts, were just ordinary folks. They loved their boy, but they quickly realized that a regular cradle wasn't going to cut it. Not even a king-sized bed would do. No, for a baby as big as Paul, they needed something special. So, his father went down to the river, gathered up an entire logging raft, the kind used to float hundreds of trees downstream, and fashioned it into a cradle. To keep it from tipping over, they had to anchor it off the coast of Maine. When baby Paul rocked in his sleep, the waves he created were so big they say it caused the famous Bay of Fundy tides. Sailors as far away as England reported mysterious 40-foot waves, never knowing it was just a baby having a restless night. And let's talk about his appetite. Regular baby food? Not for Paul. It took a whole herd of dairy cows working overtime just to fill his baby bottle. His parents had to connect a hose directly from the barn to the house just to keep up. When he got a little older and started on solid food, his mother would make him pancakes so large she had to grease the griddle by strapping slabs of bacon to her feet and skating around on it. You can imagine the sheer scale of everything in his childhood. His first rattle was a lumberjack's axe, with the sharp end filed down. His teething ring was a millstone. These stories, of course, are what we call exaggerations, the very heart of the tall tale. But they weren't just told for a laugh around the campfire. Each one carried a deeper meaning. When loggers talked about Paul Bunyan's colossal size, they were really talking about the scale of the challenges they faced every single day. The forests seemed endless, the trees were giants, the winters were brutal, and the work was backbreaking. To conquer such a vast and untamed wilderness, you needed a hero who was larger than life itself. Paul Bunyan became the embodiment of their own strength, grit, and boundless optimism. Think about it. As America was expanding westward in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was a nation flexing its muscles. The frontier represented unlimited potential, a place where anything was possible. Paul Bunyan's birth story is the perfect symbol for this era of manifest destiny. He wasn't just a big baby. He was the personification of a young, powerful, and rapidly growing nation. His wagon, pulled by a team of oxen, wasn't just a way to move him around. It was a symbol of the westward expansion, of the pioneers pushing into new territories, carving a civilization out of the wilderness. The tale of his birth is more than just a funny story about a giant baby. It's a creation myth for the American spirit of industry. It sets the stage for everything Paul would become: a master logger, an innovator, and a force of nature who could shape the very landscape of the continent. He wasn't just born, he erupted into existence. a titan ready to tame a wild land. The stories told you that if Paul Bunyan could drink a river dry as a toddler, then, surely, a crew of dedicated loggers could clear a forest. His legend gave them a sense of purpose and pride. It transformed their grueling labor into a heroic endeavor. They weren't just cutting down trees. They were following in the footsteps of a giant, building a nation with their bare hands. This is the magic of folklore. A simple story about a baby's cradle becomes a tale about naval engineering. A story about feeding time becomes a lesson in supply chain management on a mythic scale. These early exaggerations were the seeds from which the entire Paul Bunyan legend would grow. They established the rules of his world. A world where the laws of physics are merely suggestions, and the only limit is the storyteller's imagination. Every new tale that was added had to top the last. If his cradle was a raft, then his first pet had to be an ox the size of a mountain. If his cries shook the ground, then his laughter had to cause avalanches. So, as we leave the story of his incredible birth, we see a character perfectly formed to represent the American frontier. He is immense, powerful, and full of untapped potential. He is a symbol not just of physical strength, but of the immense ambition and can-do attitude that defined the era. The loggers who invented him saw themselves in his story. They saw their own struggles and triumphs reflected in his larger-than-life adventures. Paul's birth wasn't just the beginning of his story. It was the beginning of their story, to the story of how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. Join us next time for Chapter 3, where we'll meet Paul's most famous companion, the one and only Babe the Blue Ox. The stories of how they met and the adventures they shared are even bigger, if you can believe it. Thanks so much for watching and for being a part of this journey into American folklore. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter. We'll see you then. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into American folklore. Last time, we introduced the legendary lumberjack, Paul Bunyan. Today, we're turning back the clock to explore the wild, wonderful, and absolutely chaotic childhood of this larger-than-life figure. So, grab your flannel, and let's get into Chapter 3. Baby Bunyan's Wild Childhood. From the moment Paul Bunyan was born, it was clear he was no ordinary baby. Forget ounces and pounds. We're talking tons. The stories say it took a whole flock of storks just to deliver him to his parents in their cozy little cabin in Maine. And his appetite, well, let us just say his parents had to keep a herd of dairy cows on standby just for his morning milk. They say he'd drink barrels of it at a time, and his first solid food was an entire wagon load of porridge. He didn't just eat it, he inhaled it. Bolan Dolor. So the story goes. Now, you can't talk about baby Paul without mentioning his incredible strength. This wasn't your typical strong for his age kind of thing. While other babies were learning to grasp a rattle, Paul was using pine trees as teething rings. His cradle was a massive floating barge, and when he rocked himself to sleep, the waves he created were so big they caused tidal surges in the Bay of Fundy. The legend says that his first laugh was so powerful it shattered every window in their town. His parents had to politely ask him to keep his giggles to a minimum. As you can imagine, a baby of this size and strength caused a bit of a stir in his small hometown. Mischief followed him like a shadow. When he learned to crawl, every movement was like a mini earthquake. He'd crawl through the forests, and in his wake, he'd accidentally create new roads and clearings that lumberjacks would later use. One time, playing in the yard, he pulled up a sapling to see its roots and accidentally yanked up the entire town's water pipe system. For a week, everyone had to get their water from a nearby lake until the whole town pitched in to fix the plumbing. His games were on a completely different scale. A game of peekaboo with baby Paul involved him hiding behind a mountain. When he yelled, "Boo!" the avalanche he caused was said to have rerouted a river. He once tried to skip a stone across a lake, but he threw it so hard it didn't stop skipping until it landed in another country. These weren't malicious acts, of course. He was just a curious, playful kid who didn't know his own strength. Every step he took left a footprint so deep it would become a small pond after it rained. The townspeople got used to navigating these Bunyan puddles, as they called them. So, where did these incredible and, frankly, unbelievable stories come from? You have to picture the scene. A remote lumber camp Deep in the North Woods, late at the 19th or early 20th century, after a long, hard day of back-breaking work, lumberjacks would gather around the campfire. There was no TV, no internet, just the crackling fire in each other's company. Storytelling was their primary form of entertainment. It was a way to unwind, to bond, and to one-up each other. These tales of Baby Paul weren't just stories. They were a competition. A lumberjack might start with, "I heard Baby Paul drank a barrel of milk a day." Then another, not to be outdone, would chime in, "A barrel I heard it. It was a whole river." The humor came from this constant escalation. The more absurd, the more ridiculous the claim, the more everyone would laugh. It was a shared inside joke, a way to make their harsh reality a little more magical. They were celebrating the very strength and endurance that their profession demanded, but blowing it up to mythical proportions. This leads us to a really important aspect of this tradition: the cultural purpose of exaggeration in oral storytelling. These stories weren't meant to be taken literally. They were tall tales. The exaggeration served a purpose. Firstly, it was pure entertainment. It captured the imagination and made the mundane extraordinary. Think about it, the story of a baby is universal, but the story of a baby who can cause earthquakes by crawling, that's unforgettable. Secondly, this exaggeration helped create a unique cultural identity for the American logger. These men lived and worked in extreme conditions, performing feats of strength and skill every single day. By creating a hero like Paul Bunyan, who embodied these qualities to a superhuman degree, they were, in a way, celebrating themselves. Paul was their champion, a reflection of their own grit, resilience, and power over nature, amplified 1,000 times. The stories were a source of pride, a way of saying, "We are the people who tame the wilderness. We are as strong, we are tough, and we can handle anything." The tales of Baby Paul's chaos are a perfect example of this, creating ponds with his footprints or rerouting rivers with a sneeze. These are comical, imaginative ways of illustrating the immense power that loggers wielded over the landscape. They literally changed the face of the land with their axes and saws. The stories of Baby Paul doing the same, just by being a clumsy toddler, added a layer of humor and myth to their own real-world impact. It was a way to make sense of their work and its massive consequences, framing it within a fun, legendary narrative. Furthermore, these stories were incredibly adaptable. As they were passed from one camp to another, they would change. Storytellers would add local details, incorporating nearby lakes, mountains, or towns into the narrative to make it more relatable to their specific audience. A story told in Michigan might mention the Great Lakes, while one in Oregon might feature the Cascade Mountains. This is the beauty of oral tradition. It's a living, breathing thing that evolves with the people who tell it. The humor in these tales was also a coping mechanism. Life in a lumber camp was dangerous and isolated. Laughing at the outrageous antics of a giant baby was a way to lighten the mood and build camaraderie. It fostered a sense of community in a place where men were far from their families and the comforts of home. The shared laughter over Paul Bunyan's latest disaster was a powerful social glue. So, the next time you hear about Baby Paul Bunyan using a full-grown moose as a rocking horse, remember what you're really hearing. You're hearing the laughter of exhausted men around a campfire. You're hearing the pride of a workforce that tamed a continent. And you're hearing the brilliant use of exaggeration to turn everyday struggles into an enduring American legend. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were the heart and soul of lumberjack culture, packed with humor, pride, and a deep understanding of the human need to tell stories that are bigger than life itself. That's all the time we have for today's chapter on the incredible childhood of Paul Bunyan. It's a fantastic reminder that even the greatest legends start somewhere. And in Paul's case, it started with a bang and probably a small earthquake. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into American folklore. What's your favorite tall tale? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't want to miss our next chapter. We appreciate your support more than you know. Until next time, stay curious. Howdy folks, and welcome back to our journey through American folklore. In our last adventure, we talked all about the giant lumberjack himself, Paul Bunyan. But what's a hero without his trusty sidekick? Today, we're diving into the story of Paul's best friend, his loyal companion, and arguably the most famous ox in history. Babe, the blue ox. This isn't just a story about a big animal. It's a tale of friendship, loyalty, and the incredible bond between a man and nature itself. So, grab your flannel, settle in, and let's unravel the legend of Babe. Now, everyone knows Babe was big, but the stories of his size are just staggering. They say from the tip of one horn to the other was a full 42 axe handles and a plug of tobacco. Some old-timers swear it took a crow a whole day just to fly between his horns. When Babe drank from a river, the water level would drop several feet. His strength was the stuff of legend, capable of pulling anything Paul could hitch him to. But Babe wasn't born this colossal. In fact, his story begins much, much smaller, during one of the most legendary winters ever recorded, the winter of the blue snow. Imagine a winter so cold that words froze in the air, and you had to wait until spring to thaw them out just to hear what people were saying. That was the year of the blue snow. Paul Bunyan, out checking his traps in the vast, silent forest, was trudging through drifts that were taller than the tallest trees. The world was blanketed in a strange, ethereal blue hue from the snow. As he walked, he heard a faint, mournful sound, a weak little cry almost swallowed by the howling wind, curiosity getting the better of him. Paul followed the sound. There, half buried in a deep blue snowdrift, was a tiny baby ox. He was shivering so violently that the snow around him was trembling. And he wasn't just cold. The poor creature had been out in the blue snow for so long that his own coat had been stained a permanent, brilliant shade of cornflower blue. His tiny body was nearly frozen solid. Paul, with his great, warm heart, couldn't just leave him there. He gently scooped up the little calf, who was no bigger than his own mitten at the time, and tucked him inside his thick wool coat to warm him up. Paul carried the little blue ox back to his camp. He fed him warm soup and wrapped him in the softest blankets he had. He named him Babe, a fitting name for the little orphan he'd found. From that day forward, the two were inseparable. Paul nursed the calf back to health, and Babe, in return, gave Paul his unwavering loyalty. That little ox followed Paul everywhere he went, like a giant, blue shadow. And as Paul's logging operations grew, so did Babe. And boy, did he grow. He didn't just grow big. He grew at an astonishing rate. Every day, he seemed to double in size. Soon, he was no longer the tiny calf Paul could carry in his pocket. He was a mighty ox, a blue giant who stood shoulder to shoulder with his equally giant master. Their friendship was the bedrock of everything they accomplished. They understood each other without a single word. A look from Paul was all Babe needed to know which tree to pull, which log gem to break, or which direction to head. Their partnership became the engine of progress across the American frontier. Do you know how the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota were formed? Well, legend says it was from the hoofprints Babe left behind as he and Paul traveled the land, and the winding path of the Mississippi River. Some say Babe was hitched to a giant water tank that sprang a leak, and the trail of water he left behind became the mighty river. His strength was legendary. It was Babe who pulled the crooked roads straight, allowing settlers to travel more easily. He could pull an entire forest of logs to the river in a single go. There's a famous story about a particularly stubborn log jam on the Onion River. The logs were piled so high and tight that no amount of human effort could budge them. The river was named the Onion River because the wild onions growing on its banks were so strong they'd make your eyes water from a mile away. Well, Paul had an idea. He led Babe upstream and let the great ox take a long, deep drink. The river level dropped so low that the log jam was left high and dry. Then, Paul had his cook, sourdough Sam, make the biggest batch of onion soup ever conceived. The smell was so potent that Babe downstream caught a whiff and started to cry. His giant, blue tears flowed into the riverbed, creating a flash flood that washed the log jam away in an instant. This wasn't just about brute force, though the relationship between Paul and Babe symbolizes something much deeper. The harmonious partnership between humanity and the natural world. In these tall tales, man isn't conquering nature. He's working with it. Paul, representing human ingenuity and ambition, and Babe, representing the untamed power and spirit of nature, worked together. They weren't master and servant, they were partners. Babe wasn't just a tool, he was a friend, a companion who shared in the work and the rewards. This idea was incredibly powerful for the pioneers and loggers who first told these stories. They lived and worked in the wilderness, and their survival depended on understanding and respecting the power of the natural world. Babe was more than just a pet or a work animal. The stories often highlight the deep affection between them. Paul would talk to Babe for hours, and the big blue ox would listen patiently, blinking his big, gentle eyes. When Babe got sick once from eating too many of the camp's hotcakes in the cast-iron stove along with them, Paul was beside himself with worry. He stayed by Babe's side day and night until his friend was well again. This emotional connection is what makes the legend so endearing. It's not just about what they did, it's about who they were to each other. The legend of Babe the Blue Ox teaches us about loyalty, friendship, and the incredible things that can be achieved when we work in harmony with the world around us. He's a symbol of nature's awesome power, but also its gentle spirit. He is the loyal friend who stands by you through blizzards and log jams, the steadfast partner who helps you carve a new world out of the wilderness. Babe wasn't just Paul Bunyan's ox. He was the heart of the legend, a beautiful, blue reminder of a time when giants walked the earth, and the bond between a man and his animal companion could shape a continent. And that, my friends, is the tale of Babe, the magnificent blue ox. It's a story that has been told around campfires for generations, a piece of folklore that is as big and as wonderfully American as the great outdoors itself. It reminds us that the greatest strength often comes from the greatest friendships. Thank you so much for joining me on this chapter of our journey. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I love telling it. What's your favorite Paul Bunyan and Babe tale? Let me know down in the comments. And if you liked this video, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the heart of folklore. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shape us. All right, let us step away from the open prairies and journey deep into the heart of the great North Woods. Welcome back to our saga of Paul Bunyan. Today, we're diving into Chapter 5, where the legend truly takes root, intertwining with the real, rugged history of American logging. Picture this: Paul Bunyan, his giant frame casting a long shadow, and Babe the Blue Ox, his breath steaming in the crisp morning air, are heading north. They're leaving the rolling plains behind, drawn by the call of the endless, ancient forests of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. This isn't just a change of scenery. It's a journey into a new world, a world that would define Paul Bunyan and be defined by him in return. The land is vast, a sea of green pines, sturdy oaks, and whispering birches, stretching as far as the eye can see. For Paul, this wasn't just a forest. It was a challenge, a kingdom of timber waiting for its king. Imagined waking up before the sun has even thought about rising. The air is so cold it bites at your cheeks, and the only light comes from the moon reflecting off a fresh blanket of snow. This was the daily reality for the lumberjacks. You'd hear the groan and creak of ancient pines, a sound that was both a promise and a warning. Far off in the distance, the first buzz of a crosscut saw would begin, a metallic song that would soon swell into a chorus across the woods. Life in the logging camps was tough, no doubt about it. It was a life of hard labor, fueled by mountains of pancakes and strong coffee. These men weren't just cutting down trees, they were building a nation, one log at a time. They were the unsung heroes of American expansion, pushing the boundaries of the frontier and clearing the way for towns, cities, and farms. The lumberjack became an icon, a symbol of American strength, grit, and determination. In an era of rapid industrialization, when people were moving into crowded cities, the image of the lumberjack alone, powerful figure wrestling with nature itself, was incredibly compelling. He was seen as a modern-day pioneer, a master of his environment, embodying the spirit of manifest destiny. He was tough, independent, and lived by his own code in the wild heart of the continent. This romanticized image captured the public imagination. Storytellers, writers, and poets began to weave tales about these larger-than-life figures. And at the very center of this new American mythology stood Paul Bunyan. He was the lumberjack of all lumberjacks, the embodiment of their strength, their skill, and their indomitable spirit, magnified to a colossal scale. And this is where the lines between myth and history begin to blur beautifully. The stories of Paul Bunyan didn't just appear out of thin air. They grew out of the real experiences of loggers in the camps of the Great Lakes states. Around the crackling warmth of the bunkhouse stove, after a long day of back-breaking work, these men would swap stories. They'd talk about the biggest tree they ever felled, the trickiest logjam they ever broke, or the coldest winter they ever survived. Over time, these stories began to stretch. A big tree became a tree so tall it took a week to see the top. A tough winter became a winter so cold that words froze in the air, and you had to wait until spring to hear what anyone had said. This was the oral tradition, the fertile ground from which the legend of Paul Bunyan sprouted. These tall tales were more than just entertainment. They were a way of coping with the immense challenges of their lives. Logging was dangerous, isolated, and incredibly demanding. By creating a hero like Paul Bunyan, who could handle any problem with ease, the lumberjacks made their own struggles seem a little more manageable. Paul could clear an entire forest in a single day, create rivers to float his logs to the mill, and his appetite was as legendary as his strength. He was their champion, their answer to the overwhelming power of nature. He was a reflection of their own aspirations, and a way to make sense of their place in a world that was rapidly changing. The tales were a shared secret, a cultural glue that bonded these men together in the remote wilderness of the North Woods. The landscapes of Minnesota and Michigan became the primary settings for these epic tales. You can almost feel the history in the air when you visit these places today. The story goes that the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota were formed from the footprints left behind by Paul and Babe. As they trudged through the snowy landscape, the rich, red earth of the Mesabi Iron Range. Well, some say that's where Babe sharpened his horns, scraping away the topsoil to reveal the iron ore beneath. These stories connected the legend directly to the land, giving a mythical origin to real geographical features. It made the story tangible, as if you could walk outside and see the evidence of Paul's work for yourself. It's a brilliant fusion of folklore and local geography, turning the entire region into a storybook. Think about the character of Babe the Blue Ox. Babe wasn't just a pet. He was Paul's partner, his equal in strength and significance. The stories say Babe was found as a calf during the winter of the blue snow, which is what gave him his unusual color. He grew to be so large that his horns measured 42 axe handles and a plug of chewing tobacco from tip to tip. Babe was the ultimate beast of burden, capable of pulling anything, from a whole section of timber to a crooked river that Paul needed to straighten out. The creation of Babe is a testament to the importance of draft animals in 19th century logging. Oxen and horses were the engines of the industry, and Babe was the ultimate, super-powered version. A symbol of the immense power needed to tame the American wilderness. The logging industry itself was a marvel of ingenuity and brute force. Before the age of chainsaws and heavy machinery, felling a giant white pine, which could be over 200 feet tall, required incredible skill and teamwork. Two men with a long crosscut saw would work for hours, the rhythmic push and pull a testament to their endurance. Then came the breathtaking moment when the timber would begin to fall, a thunderous crash echoing through the forest. Getting these massive logs from the deep woods to the sawmills was another epic undertaking. Loggers built iced roads in the winter to slide the logs on massive sleds, and in the spring, they would drive them down rushing rivers, a dangerous dance with tons of moving timber known as the log drive. These real-life feats were so incredible, they hardly needed exaggeration to become the stuff of legend. Paul Bunyan's crew, the Seven Axemen, are another fascinating part of the mythos. Each had his own peculiar talent. There was Brimstone Bill, who could handle the hot-tempered Babe, and Johnny Inks, the camp clerk, who invented bookkeeping and saved so much ink by not dotting his IS or crossing his TS that he saved barrels of it each year. These characters were often caricatures of real camp personalities. The skilled foreman, the meticulous clerk, the grizzled old-timer. They added color and humor to the stories, creating a whole world around Paul. These tales weren't just about one man. They were about a community, a team working together to accomplish impossible tasks. It's a celebration of collaboration and specialized skill, reflecting the organization of a real logging camp. As we stand here, at the edge of this great northern forest, we can see how the story of Paul Bunyan is more than just a children's tale. It's a foundational American myth, born from the sweat and sawdust of the logging camps. It captures a specific moment in history when the nation was expanding with boundless optimism and energy. It's a story about man's relationship with nature, sometimes adversarial, sometimes harmonious, but always on an epic scale. Paul Bunyan is the spirit of the American frontier, a figure of immense power and can-do attitude, who looked at a continent-sized wilderness and saw not an obstacle, but a grand and glorious project. He reminds us of a time when the country was young, and anything seemed possible. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the North Woods. It's a story that's as big and bold as the country itself. If you enjoyed this chapter of Paul Bunyan's life, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next adventure. We love reading your comments, so let us know what you think down below. Until next time, stay curious. Gather round, folks, and listen close. Tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're stepping back in time, into the heart of America's great northern forests. Imagine the scent of pine, the crisp night air, and the crackle of a massive bonfire. This is where our story begins, not in a book but around the campfires of the logging camps, where the legend of Paul Bunyan was born. Welcome back to our series. In this chapter, we're diving into the very soul of the Bunyan Tales, the oral traditions of the lumberjacks. Long before anyone wrote his name down, Paul Bunyan lived in the boisterous, heartfelt stories shared by the men who tamed the wilderness. These weren't just simple bedtime stories. They were a vital part of life in the Pinories. Life in a logging camp was tough. The days were long, the work was dangerous, and the isolation was immense. From dawn till dusk, these men, often called shanty boys, faced the forest with axes and saws. But when night fell, something magical happened. They would gather around the warmth of the fire or in the crowded bunkhouse, the shanty, and the stories would begin. This was their entertainment, their social media, their way of unwinding and connecting. And at the center of it all was Paul Bunyan. He wasn't just a character. He was an embodiment of their own lives, magnified to epic proportions. When a lumberjack told a story about Paul clearing a whole state in a week, he was expressing the pride he felt in his own hard work. When they talked about Babe the blue ox being so big his horns were 42 axe handles apart, they were playfully exaggerating the challenges they faced every single day. These storytelling sessions were a masterclass in creativity and camaraderie. It was a culture built on humor and one-upmanship. One jack would tell a tale, and another would have to top it. You think that's something? Let me tell you about the time Paul used a whole pine tree to comb his beard. The laughter that followed was the best medicine for sore muscles and weary spirits. It forged bonds stronger than the toughest timber. These stories weren't just meant to be heard. They were meant to be built upon, added to, and passed along, evolving with each telling. The Bunyan myth wasn't a single, rigid story. It was a living, breathing collection of tales that changed from camp to camp, region to region. A lumberjack from Michigan might tell a different version of the winter of the blue snow than a logger from Wisconsin or Minnesota. In some versions, Babe the blue ox was a gift to Paul as a calf. In others, Paul found him frozen, solid in the blue snow, and nursed him back to health. These regional variations are fascinating. They reflect the local landscapes, the specific challenges of the area, and the unique humor of the men who lived there. For example, tales from the Great Lakes region often involved Paul creating the lakes themselves. Maybe Lake Superior was his personal water trough for Babe, or the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota were simply Paul and Babe's footprints filled with rainwater. These weren't historical records. They were a shared creative project, a patchwork quilt of stories stitched together across the vast northern woods. It's crucial to remember that for decades, this was the only way these stories existed. There were no books, no articles, no official versions. The entire mythology of Paul Bunyan was carried in the memories and voices of the lumberjacks. An old-timer, a bull of the woods, would pass the tales down to the younger greenhorns, teaching them not just the stories themselves, but the culture of the camp. It was a rite of passage. To know the stories of Paul Bunyan was to belong, to be part of the brotherhood of the timberlands. Think about the sheer power of that. Before the age of mass media, a folk hero of colossal proportions was created and sustained purely through word of mouth. Each storyteller was both a performer and a preserver of the tradition. They had to be animated, using their hands, changing their voices, and painting pictures with their words to hold the attention of a tired, rough-and-tumble audience. The bunkhouse was their stage, and the flickering firelight was their spotlight. This oral tradition is why the Bunyan stories feel so vibrant and larger. They were born from exaggeration. Was a river really full of hairpin turns? Well, in the story, Paul just grabbed the end of it and pulled it straight. Was the griddle in the cook's shanty really that big? Of course, it was. The cook had boys strap bacon slabs to their feet and skate across it just to grease it. This wasn't about lying. It was about competitive, creative storytelling. It was about taking the mundane and making it monumental. The humor in these tales was a key survival tool. In a world filled with danger and hardship, being able to laugh at your circumstances, to blow them up into such absurd proportions that they became hilarious, was everything. It was a way of saying, yes, this work is hard, this winter is cold, but we are tougher, we are bigger. Paul Bunyan was their champion, a reflection of their own strength, resilience, and indomitable spirit. When the logging industry began to change and the old camps started to disappear, there was a risk that these stories would fade away with them. But thankfully, journalists and writers began to visit the camps, listening to the old-timers and writing down the tales they heard. This is how the oral traditions of the shanty boys slowly transitioned into the written collections we know today. But we must never forget their origin. They weren't crafted in a quiet study. They were forged in the noisy, boisterous, and heartfelt community of the logging camp. The spirit of Paul Bunyan is the spirit of those lumberjacks, their grit, their humor, and their need to tell a good story at the end of a long day. He is a testament to the power of shared folklore to build community and make sense of a challenging world. The real magic wasn't in Paul's giant axe, but in the voices that brought him to life, night after night, around a crackling campfire. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to the logging camps. The story of Paul Bunyan is the story of America's heartland, told by the people who built it. If you enjoyed this chapter, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from our nation's incredible folklore. We'll see you in the next one. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through the colossal tales of American folklore. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 7, The Rivers He Carved. If you thought Paul Bunyan was just about chopping down trees, get ready to see how this gentle giant shaped the very landscape of North America with nothing more than his own 2 feet. We've all heard stories of Paul Bunyan, the larger-than-life lumberjack whose exploits are as vast as the forests he once roamed. We've marveled at his strength, his partnership with Babe the Blue Ox, and his insatiable appetite for flesh. But today, this chapter reveals a different side of Paul's legacy, one that is literally etched into the earth. We're talking about how a single man, a mythical figure, is said to have created the very rivers and lakes that define entire regions. Let's start with a simple, yet profound, image. A footprint. When you or I leave a footprint in the mud, it's a fleeting impression, washed away by the next rain. But when Paul Bunyan took a step, the world trembled. Legends from the old logging camps whisper that many of America's great rivers were formed by glaciers or geological shifts, but by Paul Bunyan's wanderings. Imagine him striding across the continent, his immense boots sinking deep into the soil. As he lifted his foot, water from the heavens and the earth would rush in to fill the void, creating a flowing channel. The Mississippi River. Some old-timers would wink and tell you that was just the path Paul took on a long walk south one winter. To Missouri, a little detour he made to visit a cousin. This idea that a single person could carve a river is a powerful one. It speaks to the sheer scale of Paul's character. He wasn't just living in the wilderness. He was an active participant in its creation. His every action had monumental consequences. Think about it. A casual stroll for Paul Bunyan could redirect the course of a waterway, creating new valleys and new frontiers for the pioneers who followed. It's a beautiful, almost poetic way to explain the natural world. Instead of complex geological timelines, you have a story, a personality, a purpose. And it doesn't stop with rivers. Perhaps the most famous example of Paul's landscape architecture is the state of Minnesota, famously known as the land of 10,000 lakes. Where did all those lakes come from? Well, if you ask a storyteller from the North Woods, they'll tell you it's all thanks to Paul Bunyan and his faithful companion, Babe the Blue Ox. The story goes that during a particularly harsh winter, Paul and Babe were trekking across the frozen plains of what would become Minnesota. With every step they took, their immense weight pressed down on the frozen ground, leaving behind thousands upon thousands of deep impressions. When spring arrived and the Great Thaw began, these footprints, each one a massive basin in its own right, began to fill with melting snow and rain. And just like that, Minnesota's 10,000 lakes were born. From Lake Itasca to Lake of the Woods, each shimmering body of water was a memory of their winter journey. It's such a charming and imaginative explanation for a unique geographical feature. It transforms a simple map into a storybook, where every lake is a piece of a grander narrative, a footprint left by a giant. This tale beautifully blends myth with geography, giving a magical origin to a real place. But let's pause and think about what these stories truly represent. On the surface, they're fun, whimsical tales to entertain folks around a campfire. But digging a little deeper, they reveal a profound symbolic meaning about humanity's relationship with nature. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when these stories were gaining popularity, America was undergoing a massive transformation. Settlers, loggers, and industrialists were reshaping the continent at an unprecedented pace. Forests were cleared, mountains were tunneled, and rivers were dammed. In this context, Paul Bunyan becomes a symbol for this powerful human impact. He embodies the spirit of manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's destiny and duty to expand and tame the wilderness. Paul's ability to create rivers and lakes with his footsteps is a metaphor for mankind's ability to alter the environment on a grand scale. He is, in essence, the personification of industry and progress. His actions, though mythical, mirrored the very real changes happening all across the country. The loggers who told these stories saw themselves, in a way, in Paul. They weren't just cutting down trees. They were building a nation, carving a new civilization out of the wild. This interpretation adds a fascinating layer of complexity to the Bunyan myths. Is he a hero of creation or an agent of disruption? The stories often portray his actions with a sense of awe and admiration. Creating 10,000 lakes is an incredible feat, but there's also an underlying acknowledgement of the immense power being wielded. The landscape is not static. It is being actively and irrevocably changed by this larger-than-life figure. This duality is at the heart of the American experience, with its wilderness a deep love and respect for nature, coupled with a relentless drive to harness and control it for human purposes. The genius of the Paul Bunyan folklore lies in this perfect blend of myth and geography. These aren't just abstract fairy tales set in some far-off land. They are rooted in the specific, identifiable landscapes of North America. When someone from Minnesota hears the story of the 10,000 lakes, they're not just hearing a myth. They're hearing a story about their home. It gives them a unique and personal connection to the legend. The geography validates the myth, and the myth gives the geography a soul. This connection works both ways. For people outside of these regions, the stories act as a kind of mythic map, introducing them to the geography of America in a memorable and engaging way. You might forget the exact geological process that formed the Great Lakes, But you well remembered the story of Paul Bunyan scooping them out to create a watering hole for Babe. The stories transform mountains, rivers, and lakes from simple features on a map into characters and settings in an ongoing epic. Let's look at another example. The Grand Canyon. While more often attributed to geological forces, some playful versions of the Bunyan legend claim that Paul created the canyon by dragging his giant pickaxe behind him on a long, tired journey. It's a humorous image, but again, it speaks to this theme of monumental impact. It domesticates a sublime and almost terrifying natural wonder, making it the accidental result of a giant's daily work. It is a way for the human imagination to grasp something that is almost too vast to comprehend. So, as we reflect on the rivers he carved, we see that it's about much more than just tall tailies. It's a folk explanation for the world, a symbolic representation of industrial expansion, and a way of creating a shared cultural identity tied to the American landscape. Paul Bunyan didn't just walk the land. He inscribed his story upon it. His footsteps are the lakes, his paths are the rivers, and his presence is felt in the vastness of the American wilderness. These tailies remind us that the stories we tell about our environment shape how we see it and how we interact with it. They can instill a sense of wonder, a feeling of connection, and a recognition of our own power to shape the world around us for better or for worse. The legacy of Paul Bunyan isn't just in the timber that built our cities. It's in the water that flows through our valleys and fills our lakes, a constant, flowing reminder of the giant who walked here. He is a testament to the power of a good story to transform the way we see the world, turning a simple landscape into a living, breathing legend. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of our exploration into American folklore. It's truly fascinating how these stories blend imagination with reality, isn't it? If you enjoyed this deep dive, please give this video a thumbs up. And do not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure. We've got many more tailies to tell. Until next time, keep exploring and keep wondering. Welcome back, history buffs and myth lovers. Today, we're trekking into the wild heart of North America to explore some of its most breathtaking landscapes. But we're not just looking at rocks and rivers. We're uncovering the colossal footprints of a legend. Forget millions of years of geology for a moment, and imagine a time when the Rocky Mountains were just a pile of dirt and the Grand Canyon was a mere crack in the ground. This is the world of Paul Bunyan, and in this chapter of his saga, we'll see how a giant lumberjack and his blue ox became the architects of the American West. So, how did the majestic, snow-capped Rockies come to be? Well, one version of the tale tells of a particularly challenging winter. Paul and his crew were logging up in the northern plains, and the wind was howling something fierce. It was so cold that words froze in the air, and you had to wait until spring to thaw them out and hear what anyone had said back in December. Paul, ever the problem solver, decided he needed a windbreak. Really? Asterisk. Really? Asterisk. Big one. So, he got to work. With his massive shovel, he started piling up earth and rock, higher and higher, creating a barrier to shield his camp from the relentless gales. He worked tirelessly, scooping and piling, until he had built a magnificent, jagged wall stretching for thousands of miles. And that, my friends, is how Paul Bunyan single-handedly raised the Rocky Mountains. A bit more exciting than tectonic plates, isn't it? Now, Paul wasn't just a mountain builder. He was an artist of erosion, too. The story of the Grand Canyon is one of the most famous tailies tied to him and his trusty companion, Babe the Blue Ox. As the legend goes, Paul was hauling a massive load of logs on his sled, and Babe was pulling with all his might. The problem was, the sled was so heavy, and the ground so soft, that its runners started digging in. Deeper and deeper they carved into the earth. Paul, lost in thought, didn't notice right away. He just kept walking, whistling a tune, with Babe trudging faithfully behind him. They walked 4 miles and miles, and with every step, the sled gouged out a massive trench. When Paul finally turned around, he was astonished to see the vast, winding chasm they had left in their wake. He looked at the deep scar in the land, admired its colorful layers, and supposedly remarked, "That's a Grand Canyon." The name stuck, and a natural wonder was born from a simple logging chore. Of course, Babe wasn't just dragging sleds. Another version of the story claims the canyon was carved by Babe himself. One day, Paul's logging road became incredibly crooked and winding, a real, tangled mess. To straighten it out, Paul tied one end of the road to a stump and hitched the other end to Babe. The mighty ox pulled with such incredible force that he not only straightened the road, but also dragged the massive, winding gorge of the Grand Canyon behind him. Imagine the sheer power it would take to reshape the earth like that. These stories take a monumental feature of our planet and give it a personality, a purpose born from the everyday struggles of a larger-than-life hero. It's fascinating how we, as humans, look at the immense, awe-inspiring features of our world, the towering peaks. The deep chasms and feel a need to connect with them on a personal level. We see a mountain range and don't just see a rock. We see a sleeping giant, a divine fortress, or in T's case, a windbreak built by a lumberjack. These stories are a bridge. They connect our small, human-scale lives to the vast, almost incomprehensible grandeur of nature. When you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, the sheer scale of it can be overwhelming. It is hard to wrap your mind around the millions of years of water and wind that carved it. But thinking of Paul and Babe dragging a sled through the dirt, suddenly, it becomes relatable. It transforms a geological process into an epic adventure, a story we can tell around a campfire. It gives the landscape a soul. This is the fundamental power of myth. Before we had the tools of science to explain geological uplift or erosion, we had storytelling. How do you explain a mountain range that seems to touch the sky? How do you make sense of a canyon so deep it looks like a wound in the earth? You create a narrative. You invent characters powerful enough to perform such deeds. Paul Bunyan, in this context, becomes a folk hero of explanation. He's the answer to the question, how did this get here? His tales take the unexplainable and make it understandable, even entertaining. They are a testament to human creativity and our innate desire to find meaning and order in the world around us. These myths don't just explain the landscape, they populate it, turning silent stones and flowing rivers into characters in a grand, ongoing story. They are our way of saying that even the biggest things in the world were made by a hand we can imagine, driven by motives we can understand. Let's not forget the smaller details. Paul was said to have created the famous geyser, Old Faithful, in what is now Yellowstone National Park. According to one tall tale, that was Pool's personal campfire kettle. He buried a giant pot deep in the ground to keep his coffee warm, and every hour or so, the boiling water would shoot up into the sky. The countless lakes scattered across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those are said to be the footprints left behind by Paul and Babe during a long journey, each step filled with rainwater, creating the land of 10,000 lakes. Even the morning mist rising from the valleys was sometimes said to be the steam from Paul's breakfast flapjack. Every feature of the landscape becomes a relic of his presence, a piece of a puzzle that tells his story. These stories do more than just entertain. They forge a cultural identity for the loggers, miners, and pioneers of 19th century America. The landscape was often an adversary, something to be conquered, tamed, and exploited. But the Paul Bunyan myths reimagined that relationship. Instead of a hostile wilderness, the land became a canvas for an American hero. The mountains weren't just obstacles, they were monuments to his strength. The canyons weren't just dangers, they were marks of his hard work. This narrative helped shape a uniquely American perspective on the environment, one of immense scale, boundless potential, and a touch of rebellious, larger-than-life spirit. Paul Bunyan didn't just build the mountains. He built a way for people to see themselves asterisk in asterisk. The mountains. So, the next time you find yourself gazing at a majestic mountain peak or standing on the rim of a vast canyon, take a moment. Listen closely. You might just hear the distant echo of a giant's laughter, the steady plodding of a great blue ox, and the scraping of a sled carving its way into legend. These grand creations of nature are magnificent on their own. But through the lens of myth, they become something more, a shared story, a piece of our collective imagination etched into the very fabric of the earth. Paul Bunyan's greatest creation wasn't a mountain range or a canyon. It was a story big enough to contain the wild, untamed spirit of the American landscape itself. Thank you so much for joining me on this legendary journey today. If you enjoyed this dive into the world of Paul Bunyan, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from history and folklore. Let me know in the comments which natural wonder you'd like to see get the tall tale treatment next. Until then, stay curious. Gather round, everyone. Because today, we're diving deep into one of the most legendary, most fantastical, and most downright chilled tales from the American frontier. We're talking about the great Paul Bunyan, his mighty blue ox babe, and the unforgettable winter of the blue snow. Now, if you think you've seen a bad winter, just wait until you hear about this one. Have you ever heard the phrase, "It is cold enough to freeze the words right in your mouth"? Well, during the winter of the blue snow, that wasn't just a saying. It was a fact of life. The winter hit Paul's logging camp in the North Woods with a fury nobody had ever seen. The snow didn't fall in gentle flakes. It came down in a solid, endless blizzard that buried everything. And this wasn't just any snow. It was a deep, mysterious, sapphire blue snow that covered the landscape as far as the eye could see, turning the entire world into a strange, frozen dream. The loggers would try to shout to each other across the camp, but their words would freeze solid in the air, hanging there like icy sculptures. It was a bizarre sight. You'd see frozen curses, half-finished jokes, and entire conversations just dangling in the frigid atmosphere. The only way to hear what anyone was saying was to break off the frozen words, take them inside by the fire, and thaw them out in a frying pan. Imagine the clatter and chatter as a whole day's worth of conversation suddenly melted and filled the bunkhouse at once. Now, life in the camp was tough, to say the least. The blizzards raged on for so long that the loggers completely lost track of time. Was it Tuesday? Was it January? Nobody knew. The snow was so deep it buried the tallest pines, and then kept piling up. The men had to tunnel through the blue drifts just to get from the bunkhouse to the cookhouse. These weren't just snow tunnels. They were glowing, blue-lit corridors, like something out of a fairy tale. And poor Babe, the blue ox. Babe was so massive, he usually stood head and shoulders above any snowdrift. But that winter, even he was up to his belly in the blue powder. He was already blue, of course, but after wading through that magical snow for months on end, his fur took on a special, deeper shade of azure that shimmered in the faint light. He looked more majestic than ever, a true creature of myth standing against a world of blue ice. Paul Bunyan, being the resourceful giant he was, wasn't about to let a little thing like a world-freezing blue snow winter stop him. He had a camp full of cold, hungry men, and he needed solutions. His beard, which was already long and thick, grew at an incredible rate to help him stay warm. It got so long, in fact, that he had to wrap it around his face 3 times like a scarf, and still the end of it would drag in the snow behind him. To deal with the freezing temperatures, Paul came up with some truly ingenious, if not slightly comical, ideas. First, to keep the coffee from freezing on the way from the kitchen to the loggers, he rigged up a massive pipeline. But this wasn't just any pipeline. He had his blacksmith, the great Ole, fashion a pipe so long it ran directly from the giant coffee pot on sourdough Sam's stove straight to a spigot in the mess hall. But the coffee still froze solid inside the pipe. Paul's solution? He had the men run a fire underneath the entire length of the pipe, turning it into the world's first heated beverage delivery system. The cold was so intense that the flames in the lanterns would freeze solid. The loggers would have to snap off the frozen bits of light and carry them in their pockets for later. It was a strange kind of darkness, punctuated by the eerie blue glow filtering down through hundreds of feet of snow. Paul knew he had to keep morale up, so he encouraged the men to get creative. They started carving sculptures out of the blue snow and even held ice skating competitions on the frozen river, using bacon rinds tied to their boots for skates. But perhaps Paul's greatest challenge was feeding everyone. The cook, Sourdough Sam, had a griddle so large you had to grease it by strapping slabs of bacon to the feet of 2 kitchen boys and having them skate across its surface. But with the supply routes buried under the blue snow, food was running low. Paul solved this by inventing the split pea soup fog. He had Sam cook up a colossal vat of split pea soup, and the steam that rose from it was so thick and green, it created a dense fog. The men could just open their mouths and get a full meal's worth of nourishment by breathing in the hearty, soupy air. As the winter dragged on, the story of the blue snow became more than just a tale of survival. It became a symbol of human endurance and the unshakable spirit of those tough-as-nails loggers. They faced an impossible situation, a world turned upside down and painted blue. But they didn't give up. They adapted, they innovated, and most importantly, they found ways to laugh and keep their spirits warm, even when the world around them was frozen solid. They told stories by the fire, their thought-out words crackling with humor and warmth, a stark contrast to the silent, blue world outside. They learned that even in the deepest, darkest, and coldest of times, community and a bit of clever thinking could see you through. The winter of the blue snow wasn't just a hardship. It was an adventure that bonded them together forever. Eventually, as all winters must, the season began to turn. The sun started to break through the deep blue layers of snow, and the great melt began. The sound of dripping water was the first sign of spring, a symphony to the loggers' ears. The frozen words hanging in the air finally thawed, releasing a cacophony of old shouts and forgotten songs. The world slowly returned to its familiar greens and browns, but no one who lived through it would ever forget the winter the world turned blue. And that's the tale of the winter of the blue snow. It's a classic Paul Bunyan story, full of wild exaggeration and humor, but at its heart, it's a powerful metaphor. It reminds us that no matter how overwhelming the challenges we face, no matter how deep the snow or how biting the cold, human resilience, creativity, and a good sense of humor can help us endure and overcome anything. It's a story about finding light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, and community in isolation. So next time you're facing a tough winter, or any challenge that feels like a mountain of blue snow, remember Paul Bunyan and his crew. Remember their clever solutions, their hearty laughter, and their unwavering spirit. It is a reminder that we're all a lot tougher and more inventive than we think. Thank you so much for joining me for this tall tale from the American frontier. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible legends and folklore. Let me know in the comments what your favorite part of the story was. Until next time, stay curious and keep the stories alive. Hello, story lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most delicious chapters in American folklore. We've talked about Paul Bunyan's immense strength and his giant blue ox. But have you ever wondered how a man of his size, let alone his entire crew of larger-than-life lumberjacks, kept their energy up? Well, the answer lies in the heart of the camp, the cookhouse, ruled by a culinary titan named Sourdough Sam. This isn't just a story about food. It's a tale of everyday heroism, served up with a giant helping of humor and wonder. So, grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's pull up a chair at the biggest breakfast table you've ever imagined. Chapter 10. Feeding the Crew. In the sprawling lumber camps of the Great North, the morning didn't start with the crow of a rooster, but with the earth-shaking clang of a colossal iron triangle, struck by none other than Sourdough Sam. Sam wasn't just a cook, he was an artist, a scientist, and an engineer of epic breakfasts. He stood nearly as tall as a pine tree himself, with a beard so full of flour and stories, it looked like a snow-dusted hillside. His heart was as warm as his ovens, and his mission was simple: to feed the hungriest crew on the continent. Paul Bunyan knew that a happy lumberjack was a well-fed lumberjack, and Sam was the key to keeping his men fueled for felling entire forests before noon. The cookhouse itself was a marvel of engineering. It was so vast that it took a half-day just to walk from the pantry to the stove. The griddle, where the magic truly happened, was the stuff of legend, forged from an old, flattened-out steam boiler. It was so massive that you could unsee from one end to the other on a foggy morning. To keep it greased, Sam would strap slabs of bacon to the feet of his kitchen helpers, who would then skate across the sizzling surface, a delicious dance that filled the air with the world's best aroma. This wasn't just cooking. It was a performance, a spectacle of sizzling showmanship that got everyone's stomachs rumbling in anticipation. Now, let's talk about the main event, the flapjack. These weren't your average, plate-sized pancakes. Oh no. Sourdough Sam's flapjacks were the size of wagon wheels. The batter was mixed in a trough so large it was once mistaken for a canoe, stirred with an oar from a Great Lakes schooner. When it came time to flip them, a simple spatula wouldn't do. Sam had a custom-built catapult system. With a mighty heave on a lever, a golden-brown flapjack would launch high into the air, flipping perfectly before landing on the plate of a waiting lumberjack. It was said the boys had to be quick on their feet to catch their breakfast, or risk being flattened by a delicious, syrupy disc of dough. And what's a flapjack without bacon? Sourdough Sam's bacon came from giant, wild boars that roamed the woods. Boars so big they were often mistaken for furry hills. The slabs of bacon were so thick and long, they had to be brought into the kitchen by a team of 6 men. Slicing them was a job for a true lumberjack. Sam would holler, "Bacon time," and one of the crew would step forward, grab a freshly sharpened double-bitted axe, and with a few mighty swings, slice the bacon into strips thick as your arm. The sizzle it made hitting that colossal griddle was a sound that could wake the deepest sleeper and put a smile on the grumpiest face. The coffee was just as legendary. Sam brewed it in a 30-gallon cauldron that used to be a blacksmith's quenching tank. He didn't measure the coffee grounds in scoops. He measured them in chuvalathos. The resulting brew was so strong it was rumored to dissolve a spoon if you left it in too long. The lumberjacks called it liquid lightning, and just 1 cup was enough to make a man feel like he could wrestle a bear and win. It was the perfect fuel to power them through a long day of hard labor, keeping them warm from the inside out against the biting northwoods wind. The aroma of that powerful coffee, mixed with bacon and maple syrup, was the signature scent of Paul Bunyan's camp. But feeding the crew wasn't just about massive quantities. It was about community and care. Sourdough, Sam knew, every lumberjack's favorite meal. He knew who liked their flapjacks extra crispy and who needed an extra jolt from his potent coffee. The cookhouse was more than just a place to eat. It was the warm, beating heart of the camp. After a long day of back-breaking work, the men would gather around the long, rough-hewn tables, sharing stories, laughter, and steaming plates of Sam's hearty stew. It was here, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the camaraderie of their friends, that these hard-working men found a home. The clatter of forks against tin plates was a symphony of satisfaction. The logistics of supplying such a kitchen were a tall tale in themselves. Torjet Floor Sam would simply send a crew to hollow out a mountain of limestone and fill it directly from a passing train. Vegetables were grown in a garden so fertile that pumpkins grew faster than a man could run. One story tells of a kitchen helper who sat on a pumpkin vine to tie his shoe, and by the time he stood up, the vine had grown so fast it had carried him 100 feet into the air. This blend of the fantastical and the practical is what makes these stories so enduring. They celebrate the ingenuity and spirit required to tame a wild frontier, turning everyday challenges into epic adventures. Life in a lumber camp was tough, no doubt about it. The work was dangerous, the days were long, and the weather was unforgiving. The tallies of Sourdough Sam and his incredible kitchen remind us of the simple joys that made it all worthwhile. It was the comfort of a hot meal, the taste of a perfectly flipped flapjack, and the feeling of being part of a team, a family. These stories wrap the everyday heroism of these workers in a blanket of humor and wonder. The axe used for cutting bacon wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of the strength and resourcefulness of the people. The flapjack catapult wasn't just a gimmick. It was a testament to their boundless creativity. Sourdough Sam, with his giant heart and even bigger ladle, represents the soul of the camp. He wasn't just feeding bodies, he was nourishing spirits. His kitchen was a place of warmth, laughter, and belonging in the vast, cold wilderness. He showed that even in the toughest of circumstances, a little ingenuity and a lot of good food could create a community. His legacy isn't just in the recipes for giant flapjacks, but in the warmth and camaraderie that echoed through the pines long after the last tree was felled. It is a powerful reminder that the biggest heroes are often the ones who take care of everyone else. One massive, delicious meal at a time. And that's the story of how Sourdough Sam fed Paul Bunyan's crew. It's a tale that perfectly captures the spirit of American folklore, bigger-than-life characters, incredible feats, and a whole lot of heart. Thank you so much for joining me on this culinary adventure into the past. What's your favorite part of this tall tale? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the story, please give this video a thumbs up and make sure you resubscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss our next chapter. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the amazing stories that shape our world. Thanks for watching. Howdy folks, and welcome back to our journey into the heart of American folklore. Today, we're diving deep into the towering tales of the one and only Paul Bunyan, specifically his legendary logging feats that quite literally shaped the American landscape. So, grab your flannel, sharpen your axe, and let's get into it. Now, we've all heard stories about Paul Bunyan, but the tales that came out of the lumber camps, they were on a whole other level. These weren't just stories, they were a way of life. A way for lumberjacks to make sense of the monumental, back-breaking work they did every single day. And at the center of it all was Paul, the king of the lumberjacks. Picture this. An entire forest, stretching as far as the eye can see. For any normal crew, clearing that would take months, maybe even years. But for Paul Bunyan, it was just another Tuesday. The loggers would tell tales of how Paul, with Babe the blue ox by his side, could fell an entire state's worth of timber with a single, mighty swing of his double-bitted axe. The axe head itself was so massive, it was forged from the melted-down steel of 1,000 lesser tools, and its handle was the trunk of a giant redwood. When Paul swung that axe, the story goes, the wind it created was like a hurricane. Trees would shudder and groan for miles around before a whole section of forest would just lay down, neat as a pin. One legend claims that the vast, treeless plains of North Dakota were created this way. Paul needed a clear space to lay out his timber for sorting, so he swung his axe in a great circle, and voila, the Great Plains were born. He'd clear a forest so fast that the stumps didn't even have time to realize the trees were gone. They say if you put your ear to one of those ancient stumps on a quiet night, you can still hear it whispering, "What just happened?" These weren't just boasts about strength. They were a reflection of the sheer scale of the logging industry. The demand for timber was insatiable, and the loggers faced a seemingly endless sea of trees. So, they invented a hero who could conquer the unconquerable. A man as big as the job itself, but felling the trees was only half the battle. The real challenge, getting those millions of logs to the sawmill. This is where we get the story of the Whistling River. Now, this wasn't your average river. It was said to be so crooked and twisted that it crossed its own path a dozen times. It was cantankerous and mean, and it hated carrying logs. It would buck and twist, trying to throw them onto the banks. Any normal log drive would be a disaster. But Paul Bunyan wasn't a normal man. He saw the river's stubbornness and decided to teach it a lesson. He and Babe the blue ox went to the headwaters of the river. Paul grabbed one end, Babe took the other, and with a mighty heave, they pulled that river straight. They pulled so hard and so fast that the river let out a long, high-pitched whistle of surprise and pain. A whistle it never lost. From that day on, it was known as the Whistling River, and it was so scared of Paul that it would carry his logs straight to the mill without a single complaint. And the log drives themselves. Legendary. Paul's crew, the 7 axemen, could ride a log through rapids that would swallow a steamboat whole. They'd dance on the spinning timber, using their peaveys and pike poles with the grace of ballet dancers. Paul himself, of course, didn't need a log. He'd just wade into the middle of the river, directing the flow of timber with waves of his giant hands, creating whirlpools and eddies at will, to sort the logs by size and type before they even reached their destination. Now, it's important to understand that these stories weren't just spun out of thin air for entertainment. They were born in the competitive, rough-and-tumble world of the bunkhouse. After a long day of dangerous work, loggers would gather round the stove and try to one-up each other with the most outrageous tall tale they could imagine. It was a form of social currency, a test of wit and imagination. A logger might start a story about a tough day, and another would chime in, "That's nothing. The winter I was with Paul Bunyan. It was so cold the flames in the lanterns froze solid. We had to break him off and thaw him out in the morning to get the light back." And another would jump in, "Oh yeah, well, I remember the year of the 2 winters. It got so cold that words froze in the air. We had to wait till spring to find out what anyone was talking about." This competitive storytelling wasn't just about bragging. It was a coping mechanism. The life of a logger was incredibly harsh and dangerous. The work was relentless, the pay was low, and the risk of injury or death was constant. By creating a hero like Paul Bunyan, who could tame nature with his bare hands, they were, in a way, taming their own fears. They were taking the immense, overwhelming power of the wilderness, and personifying it in a friendly giant who was on their side. This brings us to a deeper point: how work shaped identity in the lumber era. In those isolated camps, you were what you did. Your skill with an axe, your bravery on the river drive, your ability to endure the cold and the hardship, that was your resume, your reputation, your very identity. The tall tailies were an extension of this. They were a way of saying, the work we do is so immense, so imposably, that only a giant could truly master it. And we work for that giant. By telling stories about Paul, the loggers were indirectly telling stories about themselves. They were celebrating their own strength, their own endurance, and their own ability to do a job that seemed larger than life. Paul Bunyan wasn't just some mythical figure. He was the idealized lumberjack. He was every man in the bunkhouse, magnified to a colossal scale. He embodied their grit, their humor, and their indomitable spirit in the face of a wild and unforgiving frontier. So, when we look back at the great logging feats of Paul Bunyan, we're not just looking at fanciful myths. We're looking at a reflection of the American spirit during a time of immense growth and change. We're seeing the pride, the hardship, and the humor of the men who built this country, one tree at a time. Their work was monumental, and so, their hero had to be, too. Thanks so much for joining me on this trip into the tall timber of American folklore. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shape our world. Howdy, folks, and welcome back to our journey through American folklore. Today, we're diving into Chapter 12 of the Paul Bunyan Saga, a chapter that marks a profound shift, not just for our favorite giant lumberjack, but for the very soul of America itself. This is the story of the westward journey. For years, Paul Bunyan and his mighty companion, Babe the Blue Ox, were the undisputed kings of the great North Woods. Their days were filled with the thunderous crash of towering pines and the hearty laughter of a logging crew that could clear a forest before breakfast. But time, as it always does, marches on. The endless forests that once stretched to the horizon began to thin. The once abundant timber grew sparse, and the familiar ring of the axe started to echo in emptier woods. Paul, with his keen eye, saw the writing on the wall, or rather, the lack of trees on the landscape. The lumber business, the only life he'd ever known, was changing. It was time to move on. So, with a heavy heart and a hopeful gaze fixed on the setting sun, Paul Bunyan called out to Babe, and together, they turned their backs on the Great Lakes and began their long, slow journey west. This westward trek of Paul and Babe is more than just a change of scenery. It's a powerful symbol of America's own story in the 19th century. Think about it. This was the era of manifest destiny, a time when the nation was expanding at a breakneck pace. Railroads were carving paths across the continent. Settlers were pushing into new territories, and cities were rising from the prairie dust. America was growing up, moving from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse. Paul Bunyan's journey mirrors this perfectly. He was a creature of the wild, unta med frontier. His strength was the raw, physical power needed to conquer a wilderness. But as the nation industrialized, the need for that kind of raw power began to wane. Machines were being invented that could do the work of 100 men. The steam-powered skidder, the crosscut saw, the logging railroads, these were the new giants of the forest. Paul's own logging operation had become more mechanized, more efficient, a reflection of the industrial growth sweeping the nation. His move west wasn't just about finding more trees. It was about trying to outrun the very progress he helped to create. As Paul and Babe crossed the Great Plains, the landscape transformed. The dense, dark forests gave way to vast, open grasslands that rolled on forever under an enormous sky. This was a different kind of wildness, one that didn't need a giant's axe to be tamed. Here, the challenges were different. Droughts, vast distances, and a sense of scale that could make even a giant feel small. For Paul, a man whose entire identity was tied to the woods, this new world must have felt alien, almost lonely. Babe the Blue Ox, ever the faithful companion, trudged alongside him. The sheer size of their journey is the stuff of legend. They say the Grand Canyon was carved when Paul dragged his mighty axe behind him, and that the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota are simply the footprints left by Babe on a particularly muddy day. While these are tall tales, they capture the immense scale of their migration and the lasting mark they left on the American imagination. Their journey reshaped the very geography of the continent in our stories, a testament to how deeply their presence was felt. But there's a deep-seated sadness woven into this chapter. The westward journey is also a story about the fading of the wilderness. Paul Bunyan was a product of a wild, pre-industrial America. He and Babe were living symbols of a time when the continent felt limitless and its resources inexhaustible. Their retreat to the west is a symbolic retreat of the giants from a world that was becoming smaller, more measured, and more mechanized. The very idea of a frontier, that magical line between the settled and the untamed, was beginning to disappear. The wilderness that had defined the American character for centuries was being fenced in, plotted out, and developed. And as the wilderness vanished, so too did the need for its mythological guardians. Paul and Babe were becoming relics of a bygone era, their larger-than-life adventures slowly turning from current events into campfire stories. This part of the story taps into a powerful sense of nostalgia, a longing for a simpler, wilder time that was rapidly vanishing. It's a bittersweet feeling that many Americans felt at the turn of the 20th century. They looked back on the good old days of the frontier with a sense of loss, even as they enjoyed the comforts and opportunities of the modern age. The stories of Paul Bunyan became a way to hold on to that vanishing world, to remember the raw spirit and boundless optimism of the nation's youth. Think of Paul standing on a ridge in the Rocky Mountains, looking back east. He would see a land crisscrossed with railroads and telegraph wires, a land he helped build but one that no longer had a place for him. In the distance, the smoke from factory chimneys replaced the mist of the ancient forests. It's a powerful, poignant image. The giant lumberjack, the ultimate symbol of American strength and expansion, realizing that the world has moved on without him. This is the great paradox of Paul Bunyan. He is a hero of progress, the one who cleared the land for farms and cities. Yet, his very success leads to his own obsolescence. He is a force of nature who tames nature, and in doing so, he tames the part of the world where he belongs. His journey west is not a triumphant march to a new kingdom, but a slow, dignified retreat to the last vestiges of the wild. The stories say he eventually made his way to the Pacific Northwest, and even up to Alaska, always searching for forests vast enough to contain his spirit, but the world was running out of frontiers. The era of giants was over, making way for the era of industry and ordinary men. Chapter 12 is the beginning of the end for Paul Bunyan's active career, and the beginning of his new life as a permanent fixture in American mythology. It's a story that reminds us that progress always comes at a cost. As we build, we also destroy. As we move forward, we inevitably leave something behind. Paul Bunyan's westward journey is a beautiful, melancholic tribute to the wild American frontier and the larger-than-life spirit it inspired. It is a story that asks us to remember the giants who walked the earth before us and the wilderness that shaped them. Thank you so much for joining me on this leg of the journey. It's a complex and beautiful part of the legend, and I'm glad we could explore it together. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. Until then, keep the campfire stories alive. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American folklore. Today, we're rediving into a pivotal moment in the life of a legend. The day Paul Bunyan stepped out of the campfire stories and onto the printed page. Get ready for Chapter 13. Paul Bunyan in print. 4 generations. Paul Bunyan was a ghost, a whisper among lumberjacks, a tale told to pass the long, cold nights in the North Woods. His exploits grew with each telling, a true product of oral tradition. But all that changed in the early 20th century. The world was modernizing, and so was storytelling. The key figure in this transformation, a man named William B. Lafhead. Lafhead wasn't a grizzled lumberjack, but an advertising man. In 1916, working for the Red River Lumber Company, he had a brilliant idea. He took those rambling, informal tailies from the logging camps and polished them up for a promotional pamphlet. This wasn't just a story. It was a marketing tool. For the first time, Paul Bunyan's adventures were standardized, written down, and mass-produced. In Lafayette's hands, the details we now consider essential to the Bunyan mythos were born. He was the one who named the Big Blue Ox Babe. He created a consistent cast of characters and gave the stories a folksy, humorous tone that was perfect for a wide audience. Lafayette essentially curated and, in many ways, invented the version of Paul Bunyan that most of us know today. The Red River Lumber Company's pamphlets were a massive hit. Tea were free. Tea were fun. And they brilliantly associated the company with the rugged, powerful, and quintessentially American image of Paul Bunyan. Other lumber companies and businesses quickly saw the potential. The folk hero was becoming a brand ambassador. Paul Bunyan, the mighty woodsman, was now selling everything from timber to tourism. This move from the spoken word to the printed page was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it ensured Paul Bunyan's survival. While other oral folk heroes faded into obscurity, Bunyan's fame exploded. He became a national icon, a character that every schoolchild would learn about. His stories were no longer confined to the isolated logging camps of the Midwest. They were now part of the American cultural fabric. But this came at a cost. The commercialization process stripped away some of the raw, authentic grit of the original tales. The stories became less about the real struggles and camaraderie of lumberjack life, and more about creating a friendly, marketable mascot. The Paul Bunyan of the logging camps was a rough-and-tumble figures, sometimes a trickster, sometimes a hero of labor. The Paul Bunyan of print was a jolly giant, a sanitized and simplified version, perfect for advertising. Think about it. The character's very essence was altered by the medium. Oral stories are fluid, changing with every teller and every audience. They belong to the community. Printed stories, especially those created for marketing, are fixed. They are owned. The Red River Lumber Company didn't just share the legend. They shaped it to fit their commercial needs. This is a classic example of how folklore can be appropriated and transformed by corporate interests. So, we see the emergence of a dual identity for Paul Bunyan. In one sense, he remained a myth, a symbol of America's pioneering spirit in its vast, untamed wilderness. He represented the ambition and the sheer scale of a nation that was still defining itself. The idea of a man so large he could create the Great Lakes with his footsteps captured the country's can-do attitude perfectly. But simultaneously, he became a mascot. His image, often depicted with a cheerful grin and his trusty blue ox, was stamped on products, used in parades, and became the centerpiece of tourist attractions. From Minnesota to Maine, towns vied for the title of Paul Bunyan's birthplace, erecting massive statues to draw in visitors. He wasn't just a story anymore. He was an economic driver. This dual life is what makes Paul Bunyan's journey so fascinating. He is both a genuine piece of American folklore and one of the country's first and most successful marketing icons. He exists in that blurry space between authentic cultural expression and commercial branding. When we look at a statue of Paul Bunyan, are we seeing a tribute to the hard-working lumberjacks who first told his stories, or are we seeing a brilliant piece of 20th century advertising? Tansueris, we're seeing both. Lafayette's 1916 pamphlets didn't just preserve the legend, they reinvented it. They created a new canon, a Bunyan 2.0, that would overshadow the original oral versions. This new, print-based Paul was more accessible, more family-friendly, and ultimately, more profitable. He was a hero perfectly suited for the age of mass media and consumer culture. The transformation from folk hero to marketing icon tells us a lot about America in the 20th century. It reflects a shift from a rural, community-based culture to an urban, consumer-driven society. The wild, unpredictable stories of the lumber camps were tamed and packaged for a new kind of audience, one that experienced the wilderness not through hard labor, but through books, advertisements, and roadside attractions. So, the next time you see that familiar image of the giant lumberjack and his blue ox, remember the two lives he's led. Remember the anonymous storytellers huddled around a fire, spinning tales of a giant who could conquer any challenge. And remember the clever admin who saw the power in that story and broadcast it to the world, changing it forever in the process. Paul Bunyan in print is a story about more than just a tall tale. It's a story about how culture is made, shared, and sold in modern America. Thanks so much for watching and exploring this chapter of American folklore with me. It's a complex and incredible story, and I'm so glad we could go through it together. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. We'll see you in the next chapter. Howdy folks, and welcome back to the channel. Ever heard of a lumberjack so big he could comb his beard with a pine tree? Or a man who used the Grand Canyon as a water trough for his giant blue ox? Babe, of course, I'm talking about the one and only Paul Bunyan, the larger-than-life hero who stands as a titan in the world of American tall tales. Today, we're diving deep into the heart of America's stories, exploring how figures like Paul Bunyan weren't just campfire tales, but powerful symbols that helped shape a nation's identity. So, grab your axe, saddle up your ox, and let's get into the fascinating world of American folklore. Let's start with the big man himself. Paul Bunyan wasn't born in the ancient mists of time like a Greek god. No, he was a product of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when America was expanding westward with relentless energy. His stories first emerged from the logging camps of the Great Lakes region. Imagine those long, cold nights after a brutal day of felling massive trees. Lumberjacks, a tough and gritty bunch, would gather around the fire, swapping stories to pass the time and build camaraderie. It's here that Paul Bunyan was born. He was an exaggeration of their own strength and endurance. They faced towering trees. He leveled entire forests in a single day. They battled harsh winters. It caused the year of 2 winters just by being a little chilly. These weren't just silly stories. They were a way for these hard-working men to make sense of their monumental task, to feel powerful in the face of nature's immense scale. Paul Bunyan became their champion, a reflection of their own grit and spirit, just magnified 1,000 times over. The genius of the Bunyan tales was their adaptability. They were first spread orally, changing and growing with each telling. But their real explosion into national consciousness came thanks to a clever ad man named William Lafayette. In 1916, he began using Paul Bunyan in pamphlets for the Red River Lumber Company. Lafayette didn't just borrow the stories, he embellished them, giving us many of the iconic details we know today, like Babe the Blue Ox. Suddenly, this regional folk hero was a national celebrity, his image printed and distributed across the country. This transition from oral tradition to mass media cemented Paul Bunyan's place in the American pantheon. He became a symbol not just of lumberjacks, but of American industry, progress, and our supposed ability to tame the wild frontier. But Paul Bunyan didn't stand alone on this frontier of folklore. He was part of a whole family of incredible characters, each representing a different facet of the American experience. Head southwest, and you'd run into Pecos Bill, the king of the cowboys. Raised by coyotes, he could ride a cyclone like a bucking bronco and used a rattlesnake as a whip. While Bunyan represented the taming of the northern forests, Pecos Bill embodied the wild, untamable spirit of the Texas plains and the American Southwest. His tales were all about mastering the harsh, unpredictable desert landscape, reflecting the challenges and bravado of the cowboy life. If Bunyan was about industrial might, Bill was about rugged individualism and a deep, almost mystical connection to the Wild West. Then, travel east, and you'll hear the hammering rhythm of John Henry, the steel-driven man. Unlike the fantastical Bunyan and Bill, John Henry's story is rooted in a grittier reality. He was an African-American folk hero, a former slave who worked on the railroads, hammering steel spikes to lay the track. His legend revolves around a contest against a steam-powered drill. With a hammer in each hand, John Henry raced the machine, determined to prove the worth of human strength and spirit against the encroaching age of mech. He won the race, but died with his hammer in his hand, his heart giving out from the strain. His story is a powerful and poignant commentary on the Industrial Revolution. It's a tribute to the manual laborers, particularly African Americans, who built the nation's infrastructure. And it raises profound questions about progress, human dignity, and the cost of the machine age. Together, these figures, Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, and John Henry, create a fascinating mosaic of American identity. They are all heroes of labor, celebrating the physical strength and perseverance required to build a country. Bunyan is the logger, Bill is the cowboy, and Henry is the railroad worker. Each represents a key profession that drove America's westward expansion and industrial growth. Yet, their stories also reveal the different values and anxieties of their respective cultures. Bunyan's tales are often humorous and grand, reflecting a sense of optimistic conquest. Pecos Bill's are wild and chaotic, capturing the untamed freedom of the frontier. John Henry's story is the most tragic and profound, speaking to a struggle for recognition and humanity in the face of both industrial and social oppression. Through them, we see an America that is simultaneously boastful, wild, and deeply conflicted. So, why did these stories become so important? Because they were more than just entertainment. At a time when America was a sprawling, diverse nation of immigrants and laborers, these tales served as a powerful unifying force. They created a shared mythology, a set of stories that everyone could understand and enjoy, regardless of their background. A German immigrant working in a Michigan logging camp and an Irish immigrant laying track in Virginia could both find something to relate to in these larger-than-life heroes. The stories glorified their hard work, giving them a sense of pride and shared purpose. They weren't just anonymous cogs in a machine. They were part of the grand heroic project of building America, just like Paul Bunyan or John Henry. This folklore became the cultural glue for the working class. These tales helped forge a distinctly American identity, separate from the old mythologies of Europe. America didn't have ancient kings or mythological gods from antiquity. Instead, it created its own heroes from the dirt, sweat, and steel of its own experience. These tall tales celebrated uniquely American values: a can-do attitude, an indomitable spirit, a love for the vast landscape, and an almost comical sense of self-confidence. An exaggeration, they reflected a nation that saw itself as young, powerful, and capable of anything. This was a mythology born not of palaces, but of lumber camps, cattle drives, and railroad tunnels. It was a folklore for the common man, by the common man. Even today, the echoes of these stories are all around us. You can find statues of Paul Bunyan and Babe in towns across the Midwest. The name John Henry has become synonymous with unwavering determination against impossible odds. These characters have seeped into our language, our advertising, and our collective imagination. They remind us of a time when the nation was still writing its own story, dreaming up heroes as big as the country itself. They represent the power of storytelling to transform struggle into legend, and to unite people through a shared sense of identity and purpose. In the end, the rise of American folklore is the story of how a nation defined itself. Through the exaggerated adventures of Paul Bunyan, the wild antics of Pecos Bill, and the tragic triumph of John Henry, America told itself who it was and who it wanted to be. These weren't just tall tales. They were foundational myths that captured the spirit of an era and gave voice to the millions of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. They are a testament to the enduring power of a good story to shape our world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through American folklore. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And to UNT, forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so you do UNT miss our next adventure into history. Let me know in the comments who your favorite American folk hero is. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the woods, following the giant footsteps of a true American legend. We all know the name Paul Bunyan, the colossal lumberjack with his trusty blue ox, Babe. But have you ever stopped to wonder, where exactly did this giant come from? If you ask around, you might get a few different answers. And that's because Paul Bunyan, he isn't just one story. He has a story that belongs to many places. In this episode, we're exploring the fascinating regional claims to Paul Bunyan's legacy. It's a tale of local pride, creative storytelling, and how a legend can take on a life of its own, changing and adapting to the landscape and the people who tell his tales. So, grab your flannel, and let's get started on this journey through America's heartland and beyond. Our first stop takes us to the land of 10,000 lakes, Minnesota. Many people here will tell you without a doubt, that Paul Bunyan is a Minnesota native. The story goes that he was born in the north woods of the state, and his footprints are what created the state's famous lakes. Head up to Bemidji, Minnesota, and you'll be greeted by an iconic 18-foot-tall statue of Paul and a slightly smaller, but still massive, Babave. These statues have stood proudly on the shores of Lake Bemidji since 1937, becoming one of the most photographed roadside attractions in the country. The town of Brainerd also has its own claim, with a talking Paul Bunyan statue that has been delighting children for generations at the Paul Bunyan Land Amusement Park. For Minnesotans, Bunyan represents the rugged spirit of the early logging industry that shaped their state's history and economy. He's more than a myth. He's a founding father figure, a symbol of the hard work and resilience that built the state. But let's not get too comfortable in Minnesota, because just a little to the east, the state of Michigan has its own very strong claim. Head over to Oscoda, Michigan, and locals will point to it as Bunyan's true birthplace. They argue that the very first printed stories of Paul Bunyan, penned by a journalist named James Muck, were published right there in the Oscoda Press in 1906. This gives their claim a strong historical anchor. Michigan's version of Bunyan is deeply tied to the state's own immense logging boom in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The white pine forests of Michigan were legendary, and it only seems fitting that a lumberjack of legendary proportions would be needed to tame them. In towns like Grayling and Manistee, the Bunyan legend is woven into the local identity. They have festivals, landmarks, and a deep-seated belief that the tall tales first echoed through their forests. For Michiganders, Paul isn't just a story. He's a piece of their documented heritage, a testament to the era when their state was the lumber capital of the world. Now, let's journey even further east, all the way to Maine. While Minnesota and Michigan battle it out over his birthplace, Maine makes a compelling case as the place where Paul Bunyan truly grew into the legend we know today. The logging camps of Maine in the late 1800s were a melting pot of storytellers from all over, including many French Canadians. Some folklorists believe the Bunyan tales originated here, inspired by French-Canadian folklore figures like Bong Jean. In Maine, Paul Bunyan represents the grit and humor of the Yankee logger, a man who could handle the harsh winters and dense forests with a combination of brute strength and cleverness. The city of Bangor, Maine, even boasts a massive 31-foot-tall statue of Paul Bunyan, one of the largest in the country. The statue commemorates Bangor's history as a major lumber port. For the people of Maine, their deep-rooted logging traditions and the early oral histories passed down in their camps make their state the true cradle of the Bunyan legend. It's less about where he was born and more about where his spirit was forged. So we have Minnesota, Michigan, and Maine all laying claim to Paul Bunyan. But the story doesn't stop there. As the logging industry moved westward, so did Paul. You'll find Bunyan claims in Wisconsin, where they say he logged the entire state alongside Babe. Head out to the Pacific Northwest, and both Oregon and Washington have their own versions of the tale. In these regions, Paul is often credited with creating landmarks like the Puget Sound or carving out the Columbia River Gorge. Portland, Oregon, even has its own giant Paul Bunyan statue in the Kenton neighborhood, built for the 1959 Oregon Centennial. It stands as a quirky, beloved landmark, a reminder of the state's timber heritage. This westward expansion of the legend is a perfect example of how folklore adapts. Each new region took the core elements of the Bunyan myth, a giant man, the powerful ox, the incredible feats of laboran, molded them to fit their own geography and history. Paul Bunyan became a way for communities to explain their own landscapes and celebrate their own pioneering spirit. He's a character who is constantly being reborn and This brings us to a really interesting question. What makes a legend stick? In the case of Paul Bunyan, it's a perfect blend of fact, fiction, and local pride. The fact is that the logging industry was a monumental force that transformed huge parts of America. The camps were filled with real-life men who performed incredible feats of strength and endurance. The fiction comes from the natural human desire to exaggerate and tell a good story. In the long, cold nights in the logging camps, storytelling was the primary form of entertainment. It's easy to see how a tale about a really strong foreman could evolve into a tale about a giant who could fell a forest with a single swing of his axe. And finally, there's the pride. Claiming Paul Bunyan is a way for a town or a state to say, we were part of something big. Our history matters. These statues, festivals, and official birthplaces are monuments, not just to a fictional character, but to the real men and women who built these communities. It's a way of holding on to a piece of the past and celebrating the larger-than-life spirit that defined an era. The lines between what's real and what's a tall tale get blurry, and honestly, that's what makes it so much fun. So, where is Paul Bunyan really from? The truth is, he's from all of these places, and none of them. Yes, not a historical figure you can pin down with a birth certificate and a specific address. He is a folk hero, a collective creation of the American imagination. He was born in the storytelling traditions of the logging camps and raised by communities all across the country who saw a piece of themselves in his story. Whether it's Minnesota's lakes, Michigan's printed pages, Maine's oral traditions, or the towering forests of the Pacific Northwest, each region has added a unique chapter to the epic of Paul Bunyan. He's a testament to the power of a good story, to unite people, to explain the world around them, and to give them a hero who is, quite literally, as big as the American landscape itself. The next time you see a statue of Paul Bunyan, remember that you're not just looking at a tourist attraction. You're looking at a symbol of local history, community pride, and the enduring power of American folklore. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the tall tales and regional rivalries of the Paul Bunyan legend. It's a great reminder that history isn't always found in textbooks. Sometimes, it's found in the stories we tell each other. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history and folklore. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where did you first hear about Paul Bunyan? Let me know down below. Until next time, stay curious. Hey folks, welcome back. So, we've talked a lot about the big man himself, Paul Bunyan, and his blue ox. But have you ever wondered how one giant, even one as mighty as Paul, managed to log entire forests and change the very landscape of America? The truth is, he didn't do it alone. Behind every great giant is an even greater team. And today, we're diving into the stories of Paul's incredible crew, the Giant's Helpers. These weren't just any lumberjacks. These were men of legendary skill and monumental character, each one a titan in his own right. Think of them as the superheroes of the logging world. Pull up a stump and get comfortable, because you're about to meet the most remarkable team ever assembled in the Northwoods. First up, let's talk about the brains of the operation, Johnny Inks. Johnny wasn't your typical axe-wielding lumberjack. No, his tools were a pen, an inkwell, and an impossibly large ledger. He was the camp's bookkeeper, the first and greatest accountant in American folklore. They say Johnny was so efficient, he invented bookkeeping. But here's the kicker. Ink was expensive, especially when you're re-recording the meals for thousands of lumberjacks who each eat 10 dozen pancakes for breakfast. So, Johnny invented a special pen that used 9 barrels of ink at a time. Still, it wasn't enough. He eventually figured out how to write without using any ink at all. He would just think really, really hard about what he wanted to write, and the words would just appear on the page. Talk about a cost-saving measure. He never dotted his I's or crossed his T's, and by doing so, he saved over 13 barrels of ink every single year. Johnny Inkslinger represents that clever, innovative spirit of the American worker. The idea that you don't just work hard, you work smart. Now, from the brains to the brawnlets, meet Big Joe. If Paul was the general, Big Joe was his top lieutenant, the foreman of the woods. Big Joe hailed from the Ottawa Valley and was a legend in his own right, so strong he could wrestle bears and win. Some tales even say he was the one who taught Paul Bunyan how to log in the first place, though those stories are usually whispered pretty quietly around the campfire. One of my favorite stories about Big Joe is how he'd handle log jams. When the river was choked with a mountain of timber, Big Joe wouldn't use dynamite. Instead, he'd simply wade into the icy water, find the key log holding everything up, and with a mighty heave, send it flying. The rest of the logs would come crashing down, and Big Joe would ride the roaring torrent back to camp, balancing on a single log like he was taking a leisurely stroll. He was the embodiment of raw power and fearless leadership, the guy who faced the toughest jobs head-on and never backed down. And you can't run a logging camp without a cook, right? But Paul's camp wasn't just any camp. It required a chef of epic proportions. Enter Sourdough Sam, the cook. The kitchen, or the cook's hanty, was so massive that the cooks had to skate around on slabs of bacon strapped to their feet just to grease the giant griddle. The griddle itself was so large that you could unsee from one end to the other on a cloudy day. Sourdough Sam was famous for, you guessed it, his sourdough. His sourdough pancakes were the stuff of legend. The batter was kept in a massive vat, and it was so alive and powerful that one day it overflowed, creating a sticky, doughy tidal wave that threatened to engulf the entire camp. Paul had to dig a massive hole, which later became a famous cave, just to contain the sourdough starter. Sam represents the heart of the camp, the one who provides, nourishes, and keeps the whole operation running on a full stomach. Because an army, or a crew of lumberjacks, marches on its stomach. Of course, there were others, each with their own unique tale. There was Shot Gunderson, who could track anything. They say he once tracked a single snowflake through a blizzard for 3 days. Then there was O, the blacksmith, the only man strong enough to shoe babe the blue ox. The shoes were so heavy that when Old carried them, he sank knee-deep into solid rock with every step. These tracks, they say, are what created the thousands of small lakes in Minnesota. So why were these stories so important? Think about the life of a real lumberjack in the 19th century. It was incredibly hard, dangerous, and often lonely work. You were away from your family for months on end, facing brutal weather and perilous conditions. These tall tales, told around the crackling fire after a long day's work, did something magical. They transformed the mundane into the magnificent. They took the daily grind and elevated it to the level of myth. The struggle to keep accurate records became Johnny Inkslinger's ink-saving genius. The dangerous task of breaking a logjam became Big Joe's heroic river ride. The constant need for food became Sourdough Sam's pancake extravaganza. Each character reflected a piece of the American working spirit. The ingenuity of Johnny, the strength of Joe, the nurturing care of Sam. These stories were a way for workers to see themselves as heroes. They weren't just cutting down trees. They were building a nation. They weren't just laborers. They were legends in the making. Storytelling became a tool, as vital as any axe or saw, to make the impossible feel possible and to turn hard labor into a legendary adventure. It gave them a sense of pride, camaraderie, and a shared identity. They were Paul Bunyan's crew, and together they could do anything. And that's the true power of the Paul Bunyan myths. It's not just about one giant man. It's about the spirit of the team, the community, and the collective effort that built this country. It is a reminder that even the biggest tasks are achievable when you have a good team beside you. Thanks so much for joining me around the campfire today to hear about these incredible characters. The world of Paul Bunyan is vast and full of wonder, and we've only scratched the surface. Who is your favorite of Paul's helpers? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you do not miss our next chapter in this legendary saga. We've got plenty more tall tales to tell. Until next time, stay legendary. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American folklore. In our last chapter, we saw how Paul Bunyan, the larger-than-life lumberjack, became a household name. But what happens when a legend from the tall tales of the 19th century crashes into the fast-paced, media-saturated world of the 20th and 21st centuries? That's what we're exploring today, in Chapter 17, The Myth Meets Modernity. How does a figure carved from campfire stories survive in an age of television, comic books, and cross-country road trips? It turns out, Paul didn't just survive, he thrived, transforming from a rugged symbol of the timber industry into a friendly, technicolor giant. His image began to pop up everywhere, but not always in the way the old storytellers might have imagined. He became a cartoon character, his adventures simplified and sanitized for a younger audience. In the colorful panels of comic books, his immense strength was used for fantastic feats, often losing the gritty context of the logging camps. Perhaps the most visible evolution of Paul Bunyan is in the form of the massive roadside statues that dot the American landscape. From Minnesota to Maine, and even out to the West Coast, giant figures of Paul, often accompanied by his faithful companion, Babe the Blue Ox, stand as silent, smiling sentinels. These aren't just quirky attractions. They are deliberate efforts by towns to claim a piece of the legend, to anchor their local identity to this national myth. They invite us to stop, to take a picture, to participate physically in the story. These statues transformed Paul from a character in a book to a tangible destination, a landmark on the American map. They're a perfect symbol of how the myth was adapted for the automobile age, becoming a reason to pull over and explore. Of course, horse. No discussion of 20th century American culture is complete without mentioning the master of modern myth-making, Walt Disney. In 1958, Disney released an animated short film titled simply Paul. This film is arguably the most influential portrayal of the character for generations of Americans. It presented a standardized, universally appealing version of the story. The animation was bright, the songs were catchy, and the narrative was straightforward. Disney's Paul was a good-natured, almost childlike giant. The film smoothed over the rougher edges of the original tailies. The conflicts were less about man versus nature and more about friendly competition. For instance, the famous contest between Paul and a steam-powered saw wasn't a somber tale of obsolescence. It was portrayed as a spirited race, and when Paul loses, he doesn't fade into tragic obscurity. Instead, he cheerfully heads off to Alaska, forever seeking a new frontier. This optimistic, family-friendly version became the definitive Paul Bunyan for millions of people, cementing his status as an icon of wholesome American strength and ingenuity. It took the core elements of the myth of bigness, the power, the connection to the land and repackaged them for a new, modern audience. With the rise of the automobile and the post-war boom in family vacations, came the birth of the Paul Bunyan Trail entire region, particularly in the upper Midwest, like Minnesota and Wisconsin, began to market themselves as Paul Bunyan country. This was a brilliant move. It wasn't just about a single statue anymore. It was about creating an entire tourist experience built around the legend. You could drive 4 miles along designated routes, stopping at various historic sites related to Paul's mythical exploits. A lake might be billed as one of Paul's giant footprints. A collection of large stones might be the buttons that fell off his shirt. These tourist routes created a living, interactive storybook that families could drive through. Motels, restaurants, and souvenir shops all adopted the Bunyan theme. You could eat a lumberjack breakfast, stay at the Blue Ox Inn, and buy a miniature axe as a keepsake. Paul Bunyan became the unofficial, friendly host of the Northwoods, guiding tourists through the very landscapes he was said to have shaped. This transformed a folk hero into a powerful economic engine for regional tourism. So, what does all this tell us about the endurance of a myth? It shows that for a legend to survive, it has to be flexible. Paul Bunyan's story has been stretched, molded, and recolored to fit the needs of each new era. He's been a mascot for logging companies, a cartoon hero, a roadside attraction, and a brand ambassador for the great outdoors. His core identity a symbol of immense American power, optimism, and a connection to the frontier remains intact. But the way we encounter him has changed dramatically. In modern branding, we see this all the time. The Paul Bunyan name or image can be used to sell everything from pancake mix to flannel shirts to heavy-duty equipment. He represents durability, strength, and an authentic, down-to-earth quality. He's a piece of intellectual property that belongs to everyone and no one. A public domain hero who can be endlessly reinterpreted. He is a testament to the power of a good story. The tale of Paul Bunyan proves that even in our modern, digital world, we still crave myths. We need stories that connect us to our past, that explain our landscape, and that embody the values we hold dear. Paul Bunyan, the giant lumberjack born in a remote logging camp, has successfully navigated the currents of modernity to become a permanent fixture in the American imagination. Thanks so much for watching and joining me on this exploration of an American icon. The story of Paul Bunyan is a fantastic example of how folklore lives and breathes, changing with us as we change. If you enjoyed this deep dive, Please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you along for the ride. See you next time. Have you ever wondered why Americans have this fascination with things that are larger than life? Think about it. The Grand Canyon, skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, and even our legendary folk heroes. Today, we're diving deep into one of the biggest of them all, Paul Bunyan, and exploring what his colossal size really tells us about the American spirit. This is Chapter 18. This symbolism of scale. So, why did Americans fall in love with giants? From the very beginning, this was a nation built on the idea of boundless growth and limitless potential. The frontier stretched out for what seemed like forever, and with it came the belief that anything was possible. You could carve out a new life, build something from nothing, and achieve greatness. This idea of bigger is better wasn't just about physical size. It was a state of mind. It was about ambition, opportunity, and the dream of constant expansion. Enter Paul Bunyan. He isn't just some character from a campfire story. He's the embodiment of this very idea, with his trusty blue ox, Babe, by his side. Bunyan was a force of nature. He could clear entire forests in a single day, his footsteps creating lakes, and his casual toss of a tool carving out geographical features. He was the ultimate pioneer, a supersized symbol of human strength, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to tame a wild continent. The stories of Paul Bunyan became a metaphor for ambition and progress. He represented the industrial might and the can-do attitude that was shaping America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Think of the loggers, the railroad builders, the factory workers. All of them saw a piece of themselves in Bunyan's heroic efforts. He made the impossible seem possible. If Paul could create the Great Lakes just by digging a watering hole for Babe, then surely they could build a railroad across the Rockies or construct a city in the middle of a prairie. It was a symbol of manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's divine mission to expand and prosper. Bunyan was the personification of American industry, turning raw nature into the building blocks of civilization. His axe wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of progress, a way to transform the wilderness into towns, cities, and farms. Each swing represented a step forward, a new achievement in the grand project of building a nation. He was the perfect hero for an era obsessed with taming the environment and harnessing its resources for human benefit. His giant stature wasn't just for show. It reflected the monumental scale of the tasks that lay before the American people. But here's where the story gets more complex. As much as Bunyan represents progress, he also serves as a powerful, and perhaps unintentional, reminder of the environmental consequences of that progress. The very act that made him a hero, clearing vast tracts of land, is something we now view with a more critical eye. The clear-cutting of forests, the reshaping of landscapes, ... These actions have a lasting impact. When we read the old tales, they're filled with a sense of wonder at Bunyan's power. He could level a forest with ease, and it was seen as a triumphant feat. But today, we understand the ecological cost of such actions. The stories, when viewed through a modern lens, become a chronicle of environmental change. They document a time when natural resources seemed infinite, an endless well from which to draw. Bunyan, in his sheer scale, represents an appetite for consumption that we now know is unsustainable. He is a walking, talking paradox. On one hand, he's the champion of civilization, the man who carves order out of chaos. On TOT, he's an agent of deforestation, a figure whose very existence depends on the destruction of the natural world he inhabits. This duality is what makes his story so enduring and so relevant to our current conversations about climate change and conservation. The legend of Paul Bunyan forces us to confront the legacy of our own expansion. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a delicate balance between awe and responsibility. We can still look at the story of Paul Bunyan with a sense of awe. We can admire the ambition, the creativity, and the sheer audacity of the spirit he represents. That drive to build, to create, and to overcome challenges is a fundamental part of human nature and has led to incredible achievements. The wonder we feel when we hear about his grand feats is the same wonder we feel when looking at a massive dam or a sprawling city skyline. It's an appreciation for human capability on a grand scale. However, the story also calls us to a greater sense of responsibility. We are no longer living in an age where the frontier seems endless. We understand that our resources are finite and that our actions have consequences that ripple across generations. The tale of Bunyan is no longer just a celebration of unchecked power. It's a cautionary tale. It reminds us that with great power, the power to change the world around us, comes the great responsibility to be thoughtful stewards of our environment. The challenge today is to find a new kind of heroism, one that doesn't rely on dominating nature, but on working in harmony with it. We need to channel that Bunyan-esque ambition, not into consumption, but into innovation, finding sustainable ways to live, creating green technologies, and restoring the ecosystems we've damaged. The spirit of Paul Bunyan can still inspire us, but it must be a spirit that builds up, not just one that cuts down. It is about finding that balance, celebrating our ability to achieve great things while ensuring the world we leave behind is healthy and thriving for the giants of the future. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of American folklore and symbolism. If you found this interesting, please give this video a like and hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next chapter. Hello and welcome back to our channel. Today, we arrive at a quiet, contemplative chapter in the grand American saga. A story that doesn't end with a bang, but with a slow, gentle fade into memory. We're talking about the end of an era. The moment when the larger-than-life figures of the frontier began to recede, not into the sunset, but into the long shadow cast by a new age of iron and steam. This is the story of how legends like Paul Bunyan, once titans who carved the landscape with their bare hands, found themselves quietly replaced by machines. Imagine the world that birthed these tales, a vast, untamed continent, where every forest was a fortress and every river a wild beast. To conquer such a land, you needed heroes of equal stature. You needed a man so colossal, he could clear an entire forest in a single morning, whose blue ox was as big as a mountain. Paul Bunyan wasn't just a lumberjack. He was the spirit of manifest destiny made flesh and flannel. He was the embodiment of human strength, grit, and the audacious belief that nature itself could be bent to our will. Every swing of his axe echoed the ambition of a young nation pushing westward, carving out a civilization from the wilderness. The stories told around flickering campfires weren't just entertainment. They were a way for hard-working people to make sense of the monumental task before them, to turn back-breaking labor into an epic adventure. Paul was their champion, their reflection in a mythic mirror. But time, as it always does, moves forward. The air, once filled with the rhythmic thud of axes and the shouts of men, began to hum with a different sound. It was the chug of the steam engine, the relentless whine of the sawmill, the metallic clang of progress. The Industrial Revolution arrived in the North Woods, not as a conqueror, but as an efficiency expert. Suddenly, the strength of one giant man, no matter how legendary, could even compete with the tireless power of a steam-powered donkey engine that could hold logs faster than 100 men. The crosscut saw, once a symbol of teamwork and human might, was overshadowed by the circular saw, a spinning blade of steel that turned ancient trees into lumber with terrifying speed. This is where our story takes a turn, toward melancholy. Paul Bunyan didn't die in a blaze of glory, fighting some mythic beast. He simply ... became obsolete. His mighty axe, which could fell a pine in a single stroke, was now a quaint relic. His blue ox, Bay, whose strength could straighten a winding river, was no match for the locomotive that could transport tons of timber across the country in a fraction of the time. The very problems that required a giant to solve were now being addressed by human ingenuity, of a different kinda ingenuity of inventors, engineers, and industrialists. The world was shrinking, becoming more measured, more calculated. It was being mapped not by the strides of a giant, but by railroad tracks and telegraph wires. The legend of Paul Bunyan began to change. He was no longer the active, shaping force of the present, but a nostalgic reminder of a bygone past. He became a story for children, a mascot for local festivals, his image stamped on pancake boxers and tourist brochures. The raw power and untamed spirit of the original tailies were softened, domesticated for a world that no longer had room for such wildness. The lumber camps, once centers of raw, boisterous masculinity, where these tailies were born and embellished, were themselves transforming. They became more organized, more corporate. The itinerant lumberjack, a rugged individualist, was becoming an employee. The campfire was being replaced by the company mess hall. The world that needed Paul Bunyan was vanishing, and so Paul had to vanish with it. There's a gentle sadness to this, isn't there? It's the melancholy of a myth that has outlived its world. It's like seeing a grand old sailing ship, once the master of the seas, now permanently docked in a harbor, dwarfed by modern container vessels. The ship is still beautiful, still magnificent, but its purpose is gone. It belongs to history. Paul Bunyan became a ghost in the machine, a silent witness to the industrialization that made him irrelevant. His stories, once a living, breathing part of the culture, became artifacts preserved, admired, but no longer truly lived. They spoke of a time when the world felt bigger, when the challenges were physical and immediate, and when a single person's strength could seemingly make all the difference. Yet, this isn't entirely a story of loss. It's also a profound testament to the enduring power of storytelling. While the machines replaced the man, they could never replace the myth. The physical frontier may have closed, its wilderness tamed and partitioned, but the frontier of the human imagination remains boundless. The stories of Paul Bunyan, even in their softened, commercialized form, kept the spirit of that era alive. They preserved the values of hard work, resilience, and a deep, if sometimes adversarial, connection to the natural world. They became a cultural touchstone, a way for us to look back and understand the mindset of those who came before us. Think about it. The machines that replaced Paul could do the work, but they couldn't inspire us. A steam engine can hold logs, but it can't make a child's eyes go wide with wonder. A sawmill can cut wood, but it can't tell a story that captures the soul of a nation. The legend of Paul Bunyan proves that we need more than just efficiency and progress to thrive. We need stories. We need to believe, even if just for a moment, in a world where giants walk the earth, where the impossible is just a matter of having a big enough axe and an even bigger heart. The quiet end of the frontier wasn't the end of its spirit. It was a transformation. The energy that once went into physically conquering the land was channeled into building cities, creating industries, and forging a new American identity. And through it all, the stories remained. They are the echoes of the axe, the whispers of the pines, the footprints of a giant left on the landscape of our collective memory. They remind us that every era, no matter how advanced, is built upon the dreams and legends of the one that came before. Paul Bunyan may have put down his axe, but in doing so, he picked up something far more enduring: immortality in the stories we continue to tell. So, as we close this chapter, we're left with a beautiful, bittersweet reflection. Progress is inevitable, and the tools we use to shape our world will always change. But the spirit of adventure, the need for heroes, and the power of a good story, those are timeless. Paul Bunyan's quiet disappearance teaches us that while a person or a way of life can fade, the story, if told well, can live forever, preserving the heart of what we once were. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the heart of American folklore. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the myths and legends that shape our world. We love hearing from you, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep seeking out the stories. And so, we arrive at the final chapter of our journey. Not an ending, but a new beginning for the legend of Paul Bunyan. How does a figure born from campfire tailies and lumberjack boasts remain so vividly etched in the heart of a nation? Paul Bunyan is more than just a character. He is a timeless symbol of American ingenuity, strength, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. He represents the very essence of what it means to dream big too. Look at a vast, seemingly insurmountable wilderness and see not an obstacle, but a canvas. His story is one of transformation, of shaping the world not just with brute force, but with cleverness, optimism, and a hearty laugh. that could echo through the tallest pines. He embodies the American ideal that, with enough grit and a big enough heart, anything is possible. This is the core of his enduring power, a legacy that continues to inspire and captivate us. Long after the great forests he roamed have given way to towns and cities, he's a reminder that the spirit of creation is a force as mighty as any giant. The echoes of Paul Bunyan's giant footsteps are everywhere, if you know where to look. His legacy isn't confined to dusty old books. It's a living, breathing part of American culture. Drive through the North Woods, from Minnesota to Maine, and you'll find towering statues of Paul and his faithful blue ox. Babe, these aren't just roadside attractions. They are monuments to a shared folklore, community anchors that proudly proclaim, Ajaya walked here. Children first meet him, not in history class, but in the colorful pages of picture books, their eyes wide with wonder at the man who could comb his beard with a pine tree. He's the hero of bedtime stories, whispered by parents and grandparents, a gentle giant who carved the Great Lakes and painted the sunset with a flick of his wrist. These stories, passed down from one generation to the next, are the threads that keep his legends stitched into the fabric of our collective memory. Each festival held in his honor, every pancake breakfast served, is a celebration that keeps the spirit of Paul Bunyan alive, ensuring that the big man and his blue ox will never truly wander too far from home. But why do we find such comfort in these tall tales? In a country as vast and diverse as America, stories like Paul Bunyan's serve a unique purpose. They help us make sense of the immense scale of our own land. When you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, it's almost too majestic, too grand to comprehend. But to imagine it as the result of Paul Bunyan dragging his giant axe behind him, suddenly the scale becomes manageable, a little more human, a little more magical. These tales are a form of folk geography, a way our ancestors explained the natural wonders around them before science had all the answers. They filled the unknown with wonder instead of fear. There's a deep-seated comfort in believing that the world was shaped by a benevolent giant, a friend to the common man who worked with the land, not against it. In an age of complexity and uncertainty, the straightforward larger-than-life adventures of Paul Bunyan offer a kind of narrative warmth, a reassuring reminder of a simpler, more optimistic time when the horizon was limitless and the future was a story waiting to be written. And so, we picture him now, our great and gentle giant. His work is done. The rivers have found their courses, the mountains stand tall against the sky, and the plains stretch out like a patchwork quilt of his own making. The sound of his mighty axe no longer thunders through the forest. The boisterous laughter from the logging camps has faded into the whisper of the wind through the pines. Paul Bunyan rests. Perhaps he's sitting on a mountaintop, watching the sunset he helped paint, with Babe resting peacefully at his feet. His story has moved from the physical world into the realm of legend, a place where he can live forever. He is the quiet strength in the hardwood of an ancient tree, the deep blue of a northern lake, the enduring spirit of the American wilderness. The giant himself may be sleeping, but his legacy is wide awake. It lives on in the stories we tell, the monuments we build, and the wide-eyed wonder he inspires in all of us. Paul Bunyan, the friendly giant of the North Woods, has laid down his axe. But his legend, his truly colossal legacy, will walk on forever. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the life and legends of Paul Bunyan. It's been an honor to share these stories with you. If you enjoyed this series and want to explore more tales from the heart of folklore and history, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. Your support means the world and helps us continue to bring these amazing stories to light. Until next time, keep looking for the wonder in the world around you.